Okay, good evening. I'd like to call to order the May 30th Planning and Transportation Commission meeting, and please ask roll to be called.
Commissioner Alcheck, Commissioner Guardias, present. Chair Lowing,
Present.
Vice Chair Monk,
Present.
Commissioner Riggs, Commissioner Suma,
Present.
Commissioner Walfogel. That would be 5 present and 2 absent.
Okay, thank you. Are there any speaker cards for oral communications on items not on our agenda? We get one coming. Okay. Is this?
Item 1.
That's for item 1, okay.
I don't know if it's really item 1.
Okay. Okay, so we'll do that first. Recognize Mark Weiss.
Good evening. My name is Mark Weiss, 169 Bryant in Palo Alto. I actually want to talk about Olive Garden, but I understand that was going to be continued. Is that right, or should I wait?
This isn't working.
Or
Jonathan, Olive Garden,
Is this working?
agenda item.
number 3 originally, I
When
guess.
is that? Is that good?
Is it continued, or can I talk about it here?
You can speak to it because it's not on the agenda, but if you wanted to speak to it in a more timely fashion, do we know when that's coming?
So actually, yeah, I'm sorry, thank you, Chair. So this item actually is on the agenda. Staff is recommending that it be continued to...
I see.
So can I generally speak on the topic right now?
So if I...
Go ahead.
And how much time do I have to talk about this today?
First, let's get Jonathan's feedback here.
Right, so thank you. I think you're
It might just be unplugged. I don't even.
looking to speak, let me just get pulled up here so I have it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
There's a good printer.
Sorry, I don't have a packet in front of me, but there is a request for a continued item on 2515 El Camino. Staff recommends that this item be continued because we haven't had the chance to do proper noticing for this, and so we re-noticed it for your next item or your next hearing. What did we say? For, I guess it's June 13th or June 14th, whenever that next meeting is. So at this point, where you are on your agenda is open oral communications, and so I think it'd be fine if the commission wanted to receive some testimony. I'd probably wait to have it at that item when the commission can call that item up and you can have a discussion about it.
Okay.
And maybe we just reorganize the agenda so that we dispense with that one before we get into our parking discussion.
Okay, so we're going to do a few procedural things, one of which is going to be change the agenda so that one comes up next, and you can speak to it.
So you're going to continue an item, but because someone is speaking on it, you're going to...
I'll allow you to speak on it.
But you're not going to actually do your study
So maybe
session?
while the commission continues its action, I'll talk to this gentleman and let him know what we're doing.
Okay. Okay. Great. So we'll just forward it. So relative to any agenda changes, additions, or deletions, the suggestion is on the item that's to be continued, we want to move that one up and make the decision to continue it and see if the speaker would like to speak to it. Is everyone okay with that? Yep, okay. Mr. Weiss wanted to speak to it, but now he's debating if he wants to or not, or wait for the next time, so.
How much time is oral communications? 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
You can do 3 for oral communications. So just one second. If we're going to do this, then we're at the Assistant Director's report before we can get to the first item on the
This is
agenda.
oral communications, but it's not about your agenda item.
So this gentleman would like to speak under oral communications for 3 minutes. That precedes the director's report, so I would suggest that we have that opportunity now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for sorting. Go ahead.
One of my brief professional stints was in management of a semi-pro soccer team in Palo Alto called the Palo Alto Firebirds. My name is Mark Weiss, I live at 169 Bryant. And for example, we have a complex relationship with Stanford, and a wonderful relationship. And Stanford in 1994 was a co-host of the World Cup soccer tournament, which is one of the world's largest sporting events. In fact, a man named William Morrison was recently an applicant for the Human Relations Commission, and part of his resume, which is a public document, is that he was the protocol chief, and I think he spoke about that at his interview with council. And I remember going just as a fan for the '94 World Cup at Stanford. For example, 4th of July, it was USA versus Brazil. We lost 2-0. But I mean, it's sports, but it has like the world watches Palo Alto, and Palo Alto's, for a town of 60,000, we have a sort of a worldwide importance in that, we're the, birthplace of a lot of high-tech firms. We have a wonderful university. We have great public schools. And people pay attention to real estate transactions here. Even, they make the Wall Street Journal. I mean, so a lot of what, we do as commissions and boards, it isn't just to, self-govern and, provide the greatest experience for the people who live here, but other cities nearby and far away and far-fetched and even worldwide, they kind of look to us as sort of beacons of democracy and epitomizing, the role in what the average person can do and what a commissioner can do and what an elected official can do. So I've always, for about 10 years, I've been very profoundly influenced by the role of people like you and leaders and board members and commissioners and our elected officials. So what made me think about soccer is not just that there's another World Cup coming. It's every 4 years. It's a big, big tournament. The U.S. is not in it this year, but there's 32 other teams. And 535 Bryant Street has a new cafe called Toots, T-U-T-S, or Tuts, and it's run by a, I'm sorry if these ideas seem disconnected, but I don't mean to bore you or waste your time, but there's a very famous soccer player from Turkey named Hakan Şükür, and Hakansukur, and he was actually an elected official in his country after he retired from soccer. And he was the hero of the 2002 World Cup for his country, and he's a businessman, entrepreneur, and I believe a resident. And so he helps run this cafe, and at the Old Pro, there'll be a lot of people watching the World Cup, which is starting in June, runs for 30 days. And I actually have a fond memory of Olive Garden, visiting the Olive Garden in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1993 with the Palo Alto Firebirds. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Should be up there.
I know, I saw it earlier.
Okay, so Assistant Director's report.
So I think, Chair, just before we get to that, there's the item on the agenda. Maybe you covered this when I was talking about changes to the agenda. Did you address that?
Yes, we said we would switch them, but I thought you would give your report, and then we would officially act on that.
Great, thank you. So the only item I have to report is the documents that you have before you, but then also to let you know that this commission considered zoning code changes to the public facilities zone to accommodate the public parking garage and the public safety building. That ordinance is being presented to the City Council at their meeting on June 11th, and just wanted to pass that information along to you. I don't know that there's any commission representation that necessarily needs to be there for that meeting, as we're just communicating the ordinance, and there was no disagreement on that particular item. And lastly, to just note that the packet has some information that, as far as tentative agendas, I think we actually are going to be modifying some of those schedules. On June 13th, we have a study, the item that we're continuing today on 2515 El Camino Real, and we have two study sessions, one dealing with traffic safety and operations, it's an annual report, and a case study of neighborhood traffic impacts using streetlight data. And so that will be presented at your next meeting. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to address what was item number 3 in the packet, which staff is recommending be continued to June 13th. That's the 2515 to 2585 El Camino Real vesting tentative map. Is there any discussion about that, or is everyone okay moving that?
Motion.
Yeah,
Move to continue to June 13th.
okay. And second? Oldfogle and Sumo. Any other discussion? All in favor? Okay, that's been moved. Thank you. All right, so now our big and single agenda item is listed as number,
So, Chair, I think you had items to speak, requests to speak on item number 1 and on your speaker cards.
well, yeah, we better check these since it's moved around, so,
Should be item 2.
yeah, it should be item 2, but Mr. Hurchin, did you want to speak on item 2, which is the hearing on the Council Housing Work Plan referral?
I was interested in talking about the Wilton Avenue
So general.
parking structure.
I see, okay, so you want to do that under oral communications? All right, and let me also ask Ms. Wang. The parking, okay, so that's actually item 2.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. Just want to make sure we don't skip anyone. Pardon? Right, Wilton is oral communications, and we've actually passed that, but it was marked incorrectly, so if everybody's okay with that, we'll just reopen it for your comments. So that's Harold Hurchin,
So 3 minutes.
for 3, yes.
So good evening, people. I've been in Palo Alto for 30 years, and first time I've come to a public forum like this, so I'm sorry for being a little nervous. I lived on Wilton Avenue for the last 8 years and have a house there. I just heard about the structure that's being proposed for that area. I'm not against it. The only reason I'm worried about it is parking. Right now, when the Hong Kong restaurant is busy, the number of parking spots there is 0. You have to go about 10 to 12 houses down from El Camino before you get a place to park. And that's the way it is right now. And so the concern I have is that if there's a 65 or 67, not sure how many units there are, if there's 2 or 3 people in each one, that's 1 or 2 cars. I'm not sure if there's going to be enough parking allocated to not have the parking go all the way down to Park Avenue or whatever it takes to take up that many cars. So that's the main concern I have about that. So if there's enough parking space for that number of people, properly calculated based on the type of people that we expect to be in there, then I'm cool with it. But I request that you consider that and make sure the analysis done by your consultants appropriately calculated. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. No, the other speaker is on the work plan.
She's on Wilton. She's on Wilton.
She's on Delta.
It's parking study.
Oral communications. Because they're on here for Wilton.
So, Ms. Wang, I think I misunderstood you. Are you here to speak about Wilton? Parking study. Right. That's what I thought. Okay, great. So I now have 3 speaker cards. That one and no, not now. And Becky Sanders and Pei Lu. And you're here to speak on the parking study as well? Okay, fine. We're not there yet. Here, I'm just going to outline the game plan. So what we're doing on this item, this is a study session for everyone, including the public, to get presentations from consultants and staff for commissioners to ask questions and make comments on this. This comes back eventually potentially in a draft ordinance. So what we're going to do is to first have the staff report, then have the consultants report, then have public comment of these three speakers or others, and then we'll shift over to commissioners' questions and comments. And when we get to that, we want to make sure that we understand that the objective here tonight, the outcome, is to give staff direction on our comments, however they sort out. And then we can choose, if we want to take multiple straw votes at the end to give more specific direction or not. But this is all a study session in advance of a possible ordinance, so we're not conducting an ordinance discussion tonight. We're not making a recommendation to council, so we have a second bite at this apple, so to speak, and just in terms of the timeframes, I want to keep that in mind. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the staff report.
Great, thank you. Good evening, Chair Lowing and members of the Commission. I'm Jean Iceberg, a contract planner. So as expressed, tonight is a study session, no action being taken tonight. This is a discussion of issues with respect to parking's relationship to housing production and ways to encourage housing production through potential revisions to the city's parking regulations. So we met last month and talked about a range of issues in the zoning ordinance that affect housing production and affordability, from density standards to mixed-use requirements, and tonight we're just focused on parking. The chair already explained sort of the order of business tonight, but it's up here on the screen as well. A reminder about the council referral, it included these points related to parking. So first, to allow flexibility in how parking regulations are applied downtown and in Cal Ave, which have the best transit access, highest densities, and the most constrained parking supplies. Specifically looking at TDM and allowing payment of in lieu fees instead of building parking on site, as is done for office uses downtown. With respect to the second bullet, TDM, transportation staff are currently working on guidelines for enforcement, monitoring, and implementation of TDM programs in line with the council referral. So we haven't addressed it further in this report, but we will bring that back forward to you once those guidelines are prepared. And then lastly, to conduct a study of parking rates to identify the appropriate amount of parking needs for various housing types and locations, and then look at potential revisions to the parking requirements in the zoning ordinance. The report explores parking issues that may be affecting housing production and affordability based on conversations with stakeholders, primarily developers and architects who are active in the city, staff's experience implementing parking regulations, a number of data sources, including the U.S. Census, and an empirical study of parking demand and supply in multifamily apartments in the city, which you'll hear more about and is in your packet. So breaking down these issues, as you're considering changes to parking regulations, it's good to understand the trends and where things are going. Looking at the census data, we can see that most Palo Alto residents are driving to work alone. And until the city and the region make significant investments in transportation infrastructure, bike facilities, transit facilities, that's unlikely to change. But you can see some trends over time. And over the last 15 years, you can see that the share of people driving to work alone has dropped 10 percentage points. And you're seeing some minor increases across the board in other modes, including biking, walking, and transit. The findings get more interesting when you look at downtown compared to citywide statistics. So nearly half of people downtown use alternate modes to drive to work, or to get to work. And as you know, downtown enjoys better transit access, pet and bike facilities, and more retail and community amenities. And so downtown may be attracting residents who prefer not to drive and therefore choose to live downtown. And this is what planners typically call self-selection. In terms of vehicle ownership, we likewise see different behavior between people living citywide and people living downtown. So most people tend to own at least one car in the city. They drive to work, other destinations, and will continue to do so in the future. But in downtown, you can see somewhat different story. So 32% of residents report having just one car in their household, and 6% zero cars, according to the census. In contrast, this is much lower rates than citywide. So while existing and future residents in the city may still own cars, the trend suggests that they are likely to own fewer cars. And this is part of a nationwide trend as you're seeing younger people not getting driver's licenses or delaying in getting them, and instead relying on Lyft and Uber and other modes. As I mentioned earlier, we've completed an empirical study of parking demand and supply. Jane Bairdstad is here on my right from Fair and Peers, who will explain the findings from their study when I'm done with my presentation. But just to bring this back to housing production, again, buildings that have more parking than is needed add unnecessary construction costs and therefore can increase the cost of housing. So if we better align parking supply and demand, this can help reduce those costs and increase housing without impacting surrounding neighborhoods from spillover parking. Third, I wanted to mention state density bonus law. This law is an opportunity for developers to get flexibility in development standards in exchange for an increased density, increased residential density, in exchange for providing inclusionary housing on site, below market rate units on site. Additionally, developers are eligible for waivers from development standards. Specifically, state law includes reduced parking standards, which applicants can request and the city cannot deny for an eligible density bonus project. So this issue is just notable since projects right now that are required to provide 15% inclusionary, in the case of for sale, under the city's ordinance could conceivably, could by law qualify as state density bonus projects and could be using these parking rates. In reality, this isn't happening. The stakeholders that I spoke with, the developers, they tend to want to be 100% consistent with the city's code in order to get through the entitlement process, what they see as more efficiently. And so they're not making this request, but the point is they could be. So this could be an opportunity for them to take advantage of reduced parking requirements. So next, like in many communities in the Bay Area, much of site planning and massing decisions are being driven by parking and access requirement. This issue is one of the top issues mentioned by developers and architects during the stakeholder meeting about what is constraining housing production. So it's not just the number of stalls required, but it's also the driveway width requirements and the backup distances. And so in the image on the screen, you can see in those orange dotted lines how the cars are backing in and out of the parking spaces. So the staff report takes a closer look at this typical 10,000 square foot lot, which in this configuration has 3 standalone housing units with 2 spaces per unit, so 6 total spaces. It does include an exception to reduce the driveway width from 16 to 10 feet. Now here, adding a 4th unit would trigger the guest parking requirement, bringing the total requirement to 10 spaces for those 4 units. And that's when the site plan would really have to shift. So these spaces and their requisite drive aisle requirements and backup distances would necessitate either a ground floor podium, mechanical lifts, or underground parking. And based on conversations with developers and architects, none of those scenarios would be financially feasible. So you end up with just 3 units rather than 4 or 5. So we met last month, we discussed how most residential uses in downtown, California Avenue, and El Camino Real in those commercial zoning districts are required to be in mixed-use configurations. So essentially you have to do ground floor retail or some kind of ground floor commercial. And so in the same vein, the stakeholders I met with generally agreed that it's also the parking required to serve the retail that presents a challenge to making projects physically and financially pencil. So at the bottom of the screen, here's just an example of how this plays out on a recently approved site on El Camino. You have 20,000 square feet of retail along the frontage of El Camino, which requires 99 parking spaces. There's a surface parking lot of about 30 spaces, and the other 70 spaces are in a subterranean garage. So not including the parking ramps, this is about 35,000 square feet of parking area, which is significantly more than the 20,000 square feet of retail. So it's just one of those examples of a trade-off that the city has to confront as you're thinking about what's important. It's going to be challenging to continue to have it both ways. If you want ground floor retail, can you provide some flexibility in how that's provided in the parking requirements? So I met with 22 stakeholders from these 16 organizations over the last 2 months. Again, these are primarily architects and developers who are regularly using your code. And I'll provide a complete summary of the feedback next time we meet, but tonight in the report and on the screen, I've just provided the findings from, related to parking. So the feedback related to parking that I got was that the required parking ratios do not necessarily reflect demand, that parking requirements are relatively high compared to nearby communities, that they tend to drive site planning, massing, and unit yield. There was a suggestion that parking ratios account for proximity to the Caltrain stations and to allow reductions for bike parking, shared parking, and that the parking requirements should be more flexible in those locations that have better transit access to look at things like shared parking, tandem configurations, allowing projects to pay an in lieu fee as offices do, and encouraging the use of parking lifts. As I mentioned earlier, that the number of stalls required in addition to the drive aisle requirements, backup distances, that those are the things that are making site planning challenging. Also, as mentioned, as you know, that parking becomes a major expense when it's required to go underground. To help increase housing production, we can come back to this, but there's some strategies we can explore. And these are in line with the council referral. So first, to explore possible adjustments to reduce the base parking requirements for the following housing types: multifamily housing near transit, affordable housing, senior housing, rather than require parking analyses and TDM implementation. Second, to maintain the parking requirements for single-family and two-family uses. To consider exempting a portion of ground floor retail to allow more flexibility. And to look at in lieu parking programs, in downtown and on Cal Ave. So the recommendation, as the chair expressed, is to get your feedback on these issues, and then we'll come back with a draft ordinance, not a draft ordinance, a framework for the ordinance for another study session, likely next month. One update here, we do have a community meeting now scheduled for June 28th at 6 p.m. in the downtown branch library. So that will be next month. So now I'd like to hand it off to Jane Beardstadt from Fair and Pierce, if you'll just give me a minute. Okay, just click on there.
Good evening, I'm Jane Bierstead, principal with Fair and Pierce, and I'm going to just give a presentation on the parking study that we did to come up with some parking data for multifamily residential dwelling units in Palo Alto. So first I'm going to talk about the study purpose, do a quick overview of the available parking studies that we reviewed, talk about some other parking surveys that we were able to obtain, focus on the parking surveys that we did for sites in Palo Alto, and then conclude with the parking rates that were developed from those parking surveys. Well, the purpose of the study was to provide parking rate data for market rate, affordable, and senior housing multifamily projects at varying distance to transit. So one of the first steps was to gather available studies and look at those results. And so we looked at studies that were primarily done in the Bay Area, but we also obtained some studies from Southern California, some that Fair and Pierce had in their that our Southern California offices did. We also looked at Transformed Green Trip database. They have a database online of parking surveys done at residential developments throughout the Bay Area. And we also looked at the Institute of Transportation Engineers parking generation manual that has parking generation rates for a variety of land uses, including apartments and condominiums. From our files and surveys that we've gotten from other consultants, we were able to find parking surveys done at 8 sites near Palo Alto that we also provided in our report. But the main focus of the study was to do parking surveys at 9 different sites within Palo Alto. So we looked at affordable, market rate, senior housing at varying distance to transit, and this table shows a list of the different sites that we surveyed. They were selected in consultation with city staff because we wanted to make sure that we could find sites where we could easily discern the parking for the residential units. That's something that was shared with, that you can figure out who's parking for residential versus office. We also wanted to make sure that we had sites that had no individual garages where we couldn't tell if there was a vehicle parked in them. And so this is just a map that shows the survey locations. So the number of vehicles parked at each site was counted for 5 different time periods. They were counted for a weekday midday, weekday evening, weekday late at night after midnight, midday on a weekend, and a weekend night. And you can see from the graphs, so this is the number of parked vehicles divided by the number of bedrooms just to normalize the data, that the highest parking demands always occur late at night, which is not surprising. That's when everybody's home. So in this graph, it shows for the affordable housing, the lightest line is the site that's closest to transit, and as the color gets darker, that means they're a little bit farther from transit. So it shows that the site closest to transit was a little bit lower. So for market rate housing, you can see that during the peak times, the site closest to transit was a little bit lower, but there are some other times when it's a little bit higher. But when we look at parking studies, we always look at the peak rates, the peak times. Now, senior housing, there was no correlation between distance to transit. And that's not surprising, because if you think that people are going to choose to be close to transit, they primarily choose it for commuting purposes. In senior housing, there aren't as many commuters. So the results of the survey, these are, I'm going to first notice that these are parking demand rates. So these are the number of parked vehicles on the site. Usually when you come up with a parking supply rate, you want it to be a little bit higher. We presented the data in both the number of parked vehicles per unit and per bedroom, and we provide the data these 2 ways because the mix of units, the number of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units was different in the different sites, and so we wanted to, again, normalize the data. So for the affordable housing, it was the parking rates range from 0.91 to 1.3 parked cars per unit, which was 0.4 to 0.56 parked cars per bedroom. Market rate, the range was a little bit different, 0.79 to 1.15 parked cars per unit, or 0.53 to 0.75 parked cars per bedroom. And all the senior units were 1-bedroom units, so the parking rates per bedroom and per unit were the same. So it's 0.34 to 0.69. Now, in the report, we focus on the highest parking rate because you always want to make sure you have enough parking because it's a fixed quantity. So we don't average the data. We usually look at, if we had a lot of data, we would look at the 85th percentile data, but with only 3 data points each, we looked at the highest one. And from the data for affordable and market rate, the sites near transit did show a slight decrease from the highest rate of about 25%.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we go to questions, we want to do public comment on this item. Try to do these in the order received. Shirley Wang would be first up. I think that's what we have, right?
Thank you very much for having me. I live on Wilton. I am very disappointed with this flawed, biased, money-driven, and untruthful study. This study didn't involve any of Wilton residents, even after we met the builder and expressed our desire to work amicably with Palo Alto Housing with regard to parking and the traffic intrusion mitigation in order to get off on a good footing with all our new neighbors. Very, very, very disappointed. If parking is not a problem, especially to the already narrowed street like Wilton, then why city residents parking permits program even exist? And why City Council Greg Schaaf excluded Town and Country and Midtown from this overlay? Wilton is a low-profile neighborhood with a lot of minorities. Is this the reason why city picked Wilton, the first neighborhood, to build this underparking high-density housing with this new overlay? This study is made up to lower the cost of the builder at the cost of both the existing and future residents on Wilton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Palo.
Thanks for having me to speak in here. I'm very appreciated. I'm also living on the Walton Street. This PAH parking study is very biased to my extent. It's never measured how many people parked on the street and didn't ask a single resident where they parked. And okay, for the low-income housing is gonna build on our street. It's so if you say some disabled people or seniors, they don't need a lot of parking, that's not true, because they need caregivers, they have visitors, have contractors or social workers visit them. They definitely need more parkings. If they don't provide enough, they will park on our street. Another thing is the people living in low-income housing units, they often need multiple jobs. They have to go different places. If they don't have a car, how can they do that? Okay, and the other thing is, I wonder, also agree with Shirley, why our residents is not involved in this study, and also why doesn't have any study on our street and our neighborhood. As other people already mentioned, there's a Hong Kong restaurant right across from the low-income housing is going to build. They don't have a parking space. They already parked on our street. I urge you, someday you can come down to our street to take a look the night and during the day, how crowded our street already are. And we have, our community have mostly some retired folks and young professionals with younger, very young kids. As middle schoolers and high schoolers, yeah, there's some are. They have to ride a bike. If that building built there with lots of parking along the street, the safety of the children are threatened. Okay. So as I said, keep our community is made of minorities, lots of minorities, and we are humble and always keep a low profile. And that doesn't mean the city have to cave in to the developers who wants to profit at the expense of those who live there. Developers want maximum their profit and building more units rather than parking or building more parking lots. That's not acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Becky Sanders.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you so much for holding this hearing, and thank you to staff for working hard for all of us here in our beautiful city. I live near Shirley and Pay, and I just want to acknowledge that they are hoping that whatever parking study, we're hoping that whatever recommendations are made are not made with the provision that this is the best way to get below market rate housing built. We have been working with Palo Housing to get comfortable with the numbers that they're providing us. We've had some conversations, so I think we're concerned that people that might be in favor of this will see it as a panacea. You know, if we just reduce parking requirements, ease the restrictions, that there'll be lots more housing, including below market rate housing. So I just want to make that distinction clear. One thing that I heard in the staff report was we have a mandate to try to see if we can relax parking requirements in order to build more units, more housing, more density. I get that. I don't think it makes any sense to shoehorn data to try to fit a political goal. I'm pretty sure that we can continue to build housing, maybe not solve our 3-to-1 jobs housing imbalance, but I'm pretty sure that we can continue to build housing in a responsible way that does not push cars out onto the public streets, where the city has to maintain those streets, and then of course the residents have to compete with neighbors for parking spaces. I know you've heard this all before, but you will recall that the charming in lieu fees for office parking spaces in downtown was a complete catastrophe, a bomb. So yeah, you get more money. They get to buy their way out of paying for parking, but what do you get? You end up with a catastrophic downtown RPP permit program, which has got this cascading volcanic lava effect. Hello, Pele. That is now has RPP going into Crescent Park. I think that if there were adequate parking in downtown, we would not be having the RPP debacle. And on El Camino Real, all those dentist offices, totally underparked. Where do the people, their employees and the clients park? The residents. So please, that in lieu fee is ridiculous. And the stakeholders that they talk to, I guess I'm not a stakeholder. Hell's bells, I live here, but I don't have a stake in how decisions are made. Now, I know they're going to have a community meeting, and that's very nice, but a lot of this ball is in motion now. And so I don't think are any of those properties in Ventura, like the most rental-heavy neighborhood in Palo Alto, 73%, I think, of our residents are renters, and a lot of them are in these high-density soft-story units. So, and this, you know, I just think I don't think it makes sense to try to make the report fit some good goals, but I'm telling you, we do not want to have a bloodbath in our streets of people fighting over parking. And, you know, you cannot legislate who's going to have a car and where they're going to park it. And as far as I can tell, this parking study did not address, well, do you ever park on the street, or Do you ever have trouble finding parking? I mean, a real drill down, something really meaningful that we could really believe in. So anyway, just want to say that it's crowded in Ventura, and if apartments are going up in Ventura that are underparked, our children are really at risk. They're already at risk. We had a real close call. We do not want that. So I recommend that, you know what I recommend. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next speaker is Jeff Levinsky.
Pardon me, Chair, may I please add a card?
Yes, certainly.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay.
You're on.
Good evening, everyone. I'm hoping tonight you'll dig deep into the parking study. It has many, many flaws right off the bat, sorry. It ignores a simple truth that Palo Altans experience every day, namely we need more parking in our town, not less. Visit many apartment buildings at night and you'll find the streets around them crammed with cars. Underparked apartments and condominiums also compete with commuters for street parking during work days, and that's why we have so many RPPs expanding. Did the people who write this study, were they even aware of this? A good study would have looked at our streets that are crammed solid with cars at night and investigated why. One major trend that the study completely ignores is that more adults are sharing living units to be able to afford them. Your own previous commission member was sharing a house with another family. What happens when a 3-bedroom apartment is shared by 3 separate adults, each with a car? Our code only requires 2 parking spaces for that 3-bedroom apartment. So where does the third car go? It goes on the street. If you provide more parking for that unit, then more people can share it, and that actually makes the cost of housing go down. So in fact, what this study would do is possibly raise the cost, not lower, of housing. What does the study have to say about the trend of sharing? Not one word. It doesn't even look at street parking conditions. Another fact Palo Altans encounter every day is how wrong the city's parking predictions have been. I live near Edgewood Plaza, and when it was being redeveloped a few years ago, the then head of our planning department assured the city council the shopping center would have no parking problems. What do we have there today? Major parking problems. And it's not from commuters using the lot as some people incorrectly think. We've studied it, and it's caused by customers and employees and trucks coming to the center. Our city planning department was wrong about the parking there, very wrong. The city has also underestimated parking needs for offices, which is why we have to spend tens of millions of taxpayer dollars to build garages. What does the tonight study have to say about how wrong our past parking predictions have been? Not one word. These omissions are not minor. If you reduce parking requirements, you'll imperil our city for the next 50 or 100 or more years. That's because a building and its successor and the successor of that building all get grandfathered in with the lowered parking requirements. Who in this room is wise enough to know what the needs will be years from now? It's likely people will live longer. They'll stay active longer. Cars will be more desirable because they'll be safer and smarter. Total cost of ownership of cars will continue to decline. Cars will then become more popular, not less. We need more parking. Does the study even mention these possibilities? No. Instead, the study cites obsolete data about lower car ownership. In case you haven't heard, newer data collected by the federal government shows that the households are owning more and more cars, while car-free households are declining in number. I'd like staff to explain a few things. Why were only residents among the stakeholders interviewed? Why were only one resident? Why didn't the city consult local parking advocates who do far better parking studies than the one in this report? How much did this study cost the city? How did we select Fair and Peers over other firms? Do they consult for local developers, and so there's a potential conflict of interest? How did you select the 9 buildings that you have? And let me show one thing here. In the study, they claim that Oak Court Apartments is 0.8 miles from rail, whereas the mark is 0.5. Completely wrong. If you look at the map, you'll see that the mark is 0.7 miles and Oak Court is 0.6, which, by the way, reverses a table in their report that's wrong. Did staff review this study? Did they look at the details? So in sum, what we've been given is riddled with errors, omissions, biases, and possibly undisclosed conflicts of interest. It tells us nothing about parking that is reliable. We should not believe it. We should instead ask for really good studies that address the problems that everybody in Palo Alto knows exists. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next up is Joe Hirsch.
Thank you very much. I had the occasion last night to drive back from Sacramento and today to drive up and back, up to the city and back. So if anyone thinks there are fewer cars on the road, don't challenge that assumption by going on the freeways. There are cars on the road, fully packed, day and night. Saw some data in this report that suggests that fewer people are commuting by themselves to work. Problem is we have more people. So more people by a lower percentage probably equates with fewer people times a higher percentage. We haven't made any change overall to the number of cars on the road. We all know that major public transportation is essentially north-south. To get to any place, you need a car. One doesn't go to the beach, one doesn't go to Monterey or Napa or Tahoe without a car. Or even if you live more than a short walking distance from a major public transportation corridor, you're going to need a car, particularly if you're coming back from work late at night in the wintertime. My most significant concern, however, is how do you consider individual housing projects if and when lower citywide standards are established, and it can be shown that the spaces provided with regard to that particular project prove to be inadequate, thereby forcing tenants to park on the public streets, nearby public streets, neighborhood streets, where parking is already inadequate. Had the occasion today to drive Wilton Court. There will be a project coming forward on that street. There was one space available midday between El Camino and the stop sign. I don't know what the street was, the intersecting street. So if you put a project there and it's inadequate, there's going to be no place for the tenants to park, and we'll have to look at another residential parking permit program in yet another part of town. So my recommendation is to continue to handle each new housing project on a case-by-case basis against currently established parking requirements, and let the developers at that time come in and prove when an assessment of all the data and all the parameters regarding that particular project suggests that fewer parking spaces should be needed and can be allowed. Do it on a case-by-case basis, not a citywide standard that may prove, with regard to particular projects, to be totally inadequate.
Okay, thank you. And the last speaker is Mary Sylvester.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Mary Sylvester, and I'm a 40-year resident of Palo Alto. And I just want to express my very deep concern tonight about the Fair and Peers study. I, for 10 years, worked at the Packard Foundation and was responsible for a number of community grants involving stakeholder groups. Those stakeholders always involved not only developers, but community residents. I'm completely shocked, and I hope this is not going to be a precedent for the city, not to include neighbors as a vital part of the stakeholders group. I'd really like to better understand that from the city's consultant. Secondly, and I am speaking extemporaneously, but I've been long concerned about Ventura neighborhood being the part of town where we put projects that no other part of the community is willing to host. And I think it's oftentimes because of economic and racial prejudice. We feel that we can put in more commercial, more low-income housing because those residents will not fight back. Well, I'm happy to see and to report, I know several of those residents, and they have strong support in the community, and they are going to fight back, and we have their back. Please listen to them and let their voices be a robust part of your process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all the speakers who have come out tonight and dug into the study and, given us perspective. Sir.
I just wanted to support some of the previous speakers.
Just a second. Okay, so this is Mark Weiss. Okay, go ahead.
I live at 169 Bryant, but I used to live on Pepper Street, which is very near the site that the previous speakers are discussing. And I'm going to ride my bike down there from here tomorrow to give a look to some of the things they're saying. But so I have worked 25 years in the music business, a company here in Palo Alto called Earthwise Productions, and I've also for about 10 years made quite a study of our local policy making and our leadership and our elected officials and our appointed board members and commissioners. And I'm trying to develop a methodology of listening very carefully to what is said in these meetings and also reading staff reports and stuff. And I've been to quite a few of these meetings. And I want to say that the last several speakers, I really felt that they were making a lot of sense. And like to my music ear, they were like in key or in tune, and it really made a lot of sense. And so I really, people like Rebecca Sanders and Jeff Levinsky and Joe Hirsch, they're not being paid to be here. They're, representing their belief system and their neighbors, and I really, my hat's off to them. And I thank you all for your public service, but I think it makes sense to listen carefully to some of the dissenting opinions and some of the things that come in over the transom. So I too am concerned about what's going on in Ventura, what's going on in Wilton Court, and whether our consultants are really have our best interests at stake. With due respect, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's time to come back to the commission, and this is one of those subjects that we could spend all evening into the morning on. I'm going to make a suggestion for a process here, which is that we do a round of questions in order that anyone likes to do, and try to limit the first round of questions to 5 minutes. Of course, we don't know how long the answers are going to be after that. And then after that, I'd like to suggest that we do a round of comments around 10 minutes. So what that totals up is about 2 hours of discussion, debate from the time we press the buzzer. And if we need to look at that at the 2-hour mark and say, nope, we need more time, then we think we should just make that collective. But I'd like to get sort of everybody on the record here in the first 30 minutes with the questions, and then make sure everybody has a lot of time to chat about it. Is that okay with the commissioners for now? Okay, so it's the first round of questions to go to the either staff or to the consultant, correct? Okay, so light up if you'd like to speak. Commissioner Gardias? What's that?
Thank you for now. I pass for a moment.
Oh, okay.
I may return to my right
fine.
to speak. Thank you.
Okay, others with questions? Commissioner Monk?
Let me check your, I think Walt Fogel's lit up. Let me check your, you might be out of order. Are you,
Yeah, that's what's.
Walt
Do you have a light on?
Fogel has the light on.
No, hit it again.
I think this is off. Let's fix this.
No.
Walt Fogel's up.
Isn't there a tech upgrade coming here soon?
I think they passed on it. So I'll check. Are you, everyone's lit up, so it's weird.
Okay, well, you guys are sorting that
Yeah,
out.
in any event, I think.
Yeah,
Commissioner
well, they're
Walt
sorting
Fogel's
this out.
right.
You are as well?
This is on my 5-minute clock. I want to thank everyone who came out to speak tonight. If I had more time, I would list everyone's name, but thank you all for commenting. Also want to thank staff for taking on a hard problem and trying to approach it analytically. But I think that the packet page 57, the Fair and Peers memo, probably says this best. There's a comment in there, the general trend is towards slightly higher transit use and slightly lower vehicle ownership, but all the trends are small. And question for Jane is, if you look at this table on packet page 57, that is a quote from the American Community Survey. It's the percent of households with 0 vehicles. Do you see that column? I don't have another reference page for, I'm sorry, I only have the packet page.
Here. Table 1.
This is on your May 11th memo.
Page 2 of the memorandum.
Yep.
So when you talk about trends relative to that table, in the sentence beneath that table, are you aware of the margin of error that the census reports for those data points?
We did not report a margin of error, and that's why we said there's like hardly any difference.
Yeah, but if I told you that the census reports plus or minus 1% margin of error, would you still say that there's a trend in that column?
I would say, that's why we use the word slightly. It's just, there's hardly anything.
Well,
yeah.
but is slightly, I mean, is there any trend if the difference in the numbers is smaller than the margin of error?
No.
Okay, so it'd be more correct to say there's no trend in the data.
There's no, that would be, I would agree.
That'd be a more correct statement. Okay, great. The other point is in your shared mobility services paragraph. Are you familiar with UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies research report, UCD ITS RR 17-07?
I did see it.
And are the findings in that report consistent with your statement about, I mean, even the statement TNCs enable a car-free or car-light lifestyle, is that consistent with the findings in the UC Davis report?
We did not compare that for this. These are just some, kind of things to think about in the future that, like, there's no data to support what's going on in the future.
Well, sure, but I mean, we can all imagine fairy dust, but I'm trying to stick to, what we know from actual studies and actual, if we're going to use numbers, we should use numbers in a correct way. Would you agree with that?
That's correct. And so I do not think that we unfairly characterized anything in here.
Okay, but I think you just agreed that your statement that slightly lower rates, or trends, is something that's not substantiated by the numbers?
What we reported was that we didn't have the margin of error reported in table 1, and then.
Right, but this is a memo
If
from
it's
Fair and
1%, I think we're just splitting hairs, so I'm not going to argue with you on that.
No, it's not splitting hairs because there's no trend.
But that's no trend, slightly lower. I think
I think they're
it's not saying much of a difference, but
well, it is saying something different. So, but you would agree with the statement that there's no trend.
We already I think went over that.
Okay, great. That's a good starting point. The other data question.
Sorry, I just want to understand that point, though, for my clarification. So I just want to re-ask that question that you had asked Commissioner Waldfogel. Do we know what the margin of error is in Table 1? Is that data that?
Yeah, it's in the census. It's in the census. I just looked at it in the census report.
Okay,
it's plus or minus 1%.
Okay, so you're reporting that it's 1%.
Yeah, I'm reporting that the margin of error is bigger than the change in the data points.
Okay.
Which means that the data points aren't really, we're doing something that's not statistically.
I just wanted to know where the margin of error came from.
Yeah, that's great. one other question for you, and I think this one is directed to staff. But if we look at packet page 14, and actually, no, we can also do this from your, I think you have the same chart in your presentation. Go to page 7 of your presentation. This is the chart 3 of trends in car ownership. So if you add up in the downtown district the percent of 2+ vehicle households and the percent of 1 vehicle households, what percent do you get? Just looking at that chart 3.
Sorry, you're adding the 6% and the 32?
No, I'm
38.
adding the 2+ and the 1. So how many households have vehicles?
23.
What?
You're adding the 21, I'm sorry, I'm not following what you're asking.
I'm asking you to add, so what percent of households have 2+ vehicles in the downtown district?
62%.
And what percent have 1 vehicle?
32%.
So what is the sum of what percent of households have 1 or more vehicles in the downtown district?
94.
94%.
Right.
Okay. So we're saying that roughly 1 parking space per household is a floor.
1 parking space per household is?
It would be a floor on whatever formula that we have. I mean, any formula that comes to less than 1 per household would not be consistent with the ACS census data.
This suggests that of the household surveys, 94% of households have 1 or more vehicles available to them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thought it was a math quiz, sorry. I mean, the numbers didn't add to 100.
Yeah, we didn't talk about margin of error there.
No, I mean, we didn't report that, no.
Okay. We're going to move on to the next one. Commissioner Sumas lit.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and welcome for those of you from members of the public that don't often or have never come to speak at council, the Planning Commission, before. And thanks to staff. And thank you, Commissioner Waldvogel. I was also interested in the very questions you asked. But I also had questions about, that was the main one, and really to amplify that even downtown, which is our most transit-rich area, 96% of the people have at least 1 car, and we don't know how many have 3 or 4. But anyhow, another question I had was about the stakeholder group, and I think some members of the public brought this up, and why there was 1 resident, and who was the resident, and where did the resident live, and how was that resident chosen?
So the stakeholders came about as we were analyzing the entire zoning ordinance. So specifically, we were really only talking to folks who use the ordinance on a daily basis. The council referral and all of these items emanated from the comp plan and the comp plan policies, which was, as you know, underwent a very long and robust community outreach process. The resident I spoke with reached out to us specifically, and so I did meet with that person.
I think you mentioned that.
So that's how that came about.
Yeah, I recall you mentioned that the last time. So why did the study not survey the residents of the 9 sites? Because I've read other studies, especially there's one that comes to mind. It's an affordable housing study from First Community in San Jose, who they really wanted to find out about housing, especially for affordable housing sites. We particularly want to be careful not to incur extra financial burden to create those by having too many parking spaces. And they were well aware that they have to balance that with the with the expectations of the community that they're going to be in, and also with serving their residents. And so why weren't the residents of the sites for this study surveyed?
So the surveys were done just to count the number of parked vehicles. It was completely unbiased. So like what kind of questions would you like, what kind of information would you have liked to have gleaned from the residents?
Whether they found the parking convenient and safe, and by meaning late at night they could get safely to their front doors, whether they actually had enough parking. We have a general parking problem shortage in Palo Alto, and there are some neighborhoods that are very affected by it. I went to all but one of the 9 sites, and this is anecdotal, between 11 and 2:30 last Thursday, and for instance, the Colorado site is parked solid on both sides of the street. I noted that at Oak Court, the 2 sides that you can park on were parked pretty solidly, and every single car I walked by had an Oak Court hang tag, because they have a hang tag there. And about half of them additionally had RPP tags. So it's hard to, I really appreciate how difficult a problem parking is to solve. You try to fix it one place and it pops up another place, but I think it is, I think that it would be better to redo this study and really survey the people that are using this parking, because they'll know the most about it. So let me look at some more questions. And then I wish the Planning Commission had more input to the methodology you were going to be using. There was, I don't think, any consideration of street parking around the sites, was there?
We really tried to pick sites that had, that we could see that all the cars would park on site, so that we were expecting them not to be parking off site. So that was, you know, part of it. And I have to go back and check with the actual parking, collect the people, actually the data collection, because it's one thing they typically look at to see if there's on-street parking, but I need to check into that, because we really try to measure the whole demand.
Yeah, but oftentimes and another thing I wanted to know, you didn't seem to differentiate between sites that had all assigned parking or general parking. The ones I looked at were all assigned, and so one would anticipate, and you can tell me if this is, to me it seems to make sense, that ones with all assigned spots would always have a higher rate of vacancy when you might have been looking, as nobody can use their spot but them if they're not there. And so, like I said, I went to all of them but one, and they were all assigned. And that's why I presume people park on the street, because it's closer to their front door. And then I was wondering, over the period, we didn't actually get to see any of the raw data. So we kind of have a general feeling it was done in November and December. And I was wondering if you could provide us the actual dates. And I'll just finish this last question, sorry. And how many times over that 2-month period you surveyed each site? I understand you did weekdays 3 times and weekends 2 times, but how many times total did you survey the site?
So we just surveyed it those 5 different times to try to get the peak, and that's typical practice. And
so you got a snapshot of 5 different times for each location, and that was it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's typical.
Commissioner Alcheck?
Welcome to the Shark Tank.
Thank you.
I think we have an aspiring cross-examiner among us tonight. Well, let me say, look, thank you for your work. I think you're well aware of our community's appetite for data analytics, and studies like this one are incredibly important to our commission's work. I just want to, I don't have a lot of questions about the study. I understood what I read, but I think it's probably worth going through a few questions for the community and sort of dispense with some of the, well, let's just go through them. How was Fair and Peers chosen for the work?
So my recollection, I mean, we have all kinds of professional service agreements that we work with a variety of consultants. We certainly know Fair and Pierce's work, their reputation. We know that they've done work with other, for their work spans private and public sector. This is true for a lot of the consultants that we work with. And so we prepared a scope of work and we sent it to the firm, and the response was in line with our expectations, and so we were able to proceed with hiring them to conduct this study.
I'd love to sort of get a quick response to the notion that this work product was pursued in an effort to bolster some staff agenda. I mean, was that the request? Were you seeking specific answers for a purpose?
Yeah, no, we weren't. We were simply trying to collect data and present it, and we recognize that it is a snapshot in time. It does reflect the data is only as good as the information that's out there. When we conduct our studies, we tried to be as thorough as we could with the budget that we had. It does take resources to do this. We also knew that, there's only so much, it's difficult sometimes to satisfy the data needs that we have, but I think we've heard some good comments this evening, and we'll certainly do what we can to follow up on some of those points. But no, the idea that this is somehow trying to advance an agenda is not true. We are trying to present data, and we are interested in the Commission's feedback and the community's feedback on the information. We're not, again, there's no recommendation. We're just looking for some feedback.
Great. I'll just acknowledge that I am hopeful that this effort represents a new approach in our city to sort of validating or invalidating the numerous and often sort of under-verified anecdotes that we hear as a result of the fact that this is a very politicized process. And so this sort of information gathering activity should be welcomed, and I think it's sort of important to sort of acknowledge while we're in this room just sort of the inherent reliability problems with anecdotal evidence. And so this is why we're here, right? Because anecdotal evidence is problematic and we need data. Okay, so let me turn now to you, Jade. I'm sure you're familiar with the saying, don't shoot the messenger. Is there any reason to suspect the way you approach this? Is there any reason to suspect that your firm had some bias as you approached this work? I just want to, I don't have questions about the study, but those were some of the things we heard tonight, and I want to get that off the table, and so if you'd like to respond to that at all?
Of course. Like any consulting firm, our reputation is everything, and we have to provide unbiased data, unbiased advice, no matter who our client is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in business. And Fair and Peers really prides itself at providing good advice and being very objective. A lot of my work is doing transportation impact studies for land use development projects. Those all go through city contracts now because of this concern about bias, but we always do our studies with the best available data and to provide the best advice. Now with parking, like I said when I was explaining the results, we look at the high parking rate. We don't look at an average parking rate, and we don't cherry pick the data that we present or try to provide a good, wide variety of data so that you have the information you need to make a decision.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of my questions.
Okay, I'll follow up with a few questions here. My timer on. In the study, you presented 9 in Palo Alto, right? And that's how many you did?
That's correct.
You did 9 and presented 9, right?
Correct.
Yeah, that's right. I presume that was the case. And I think what I heard you say is that you didn't do any of that other than counting spaces you didn't do anything else, like evaluate spillover into neighborhoods or anything like that?
Like I said, the way we designed the survey was to try to get any of that kind of spillover parking. But I know that's really important, so I'm going to go back and double check to make sure that we got that. So like if there's any people parking on the street affiliated with the apartment complex, that should have been included.
Okay, good, thanks for clarifying that. And then, so you also didn't go to any of the residents. Is there a constraint there in terms of privacy or anything to actually even ask how many of them own cars? There could be, so.
Yeah. I don't think there would not have been a constraint, but like I said, most of the peak parking times are in the middle of the night, so that would have been a hard time to ask people.
Oh, wow, they're home then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not something. It's something that could be done. Just ask people whether or not there's enough parking, and that could be added.
Okay. Question for staff on the page 17 on the SDBL. What percentage of, how's the BMR calculated in there? So this is page 17 and the state density bonus law. In exchange providing on-site below market rate units to qualify, is there a percentage of the total?
Right. So it depends on the level of affordability. So the minimum threshold, I believe, to be eligible for state density bonus is 5% very low, 10% low, moderate, or senior.
Okay. Because just in my own mind, I'm trying to think about how this might get us much of the way that we need to get. And not to stop there necessarily, but I'm just trying to evaluate, if we can get down the pipe here with that one. Like we've set up here before and talked about the importance of definitions such as high-quality transit. So obviously, anything we do like this, we're doing off into the future, but I think we have to make some assumptions, requirements about what high-quality transit is, and whether it's the current bus system or the stand-up all the way to San Francisco train system, there's some gaps there that we'd have to look at, I think. And then on page 20, let's see, where you talk about, in one of your potential strategies, this is a staff question, you talk about number one, reduce base parking crowd without the need for a parking analysis or implementation of TDM measures. And so my question there is just why? Is that recommendation potentially because of cost or feasibility or?
So this is, again, thinking about housing production and how to remove constraints. This is essentially changing something from a discretionary action where in order to get because right now your code allows reductions, but in order to get that reduction, you would need to do a parking analysis, request that reduction, do TDM measures. And then rather go through that process to simplify it and simply codify in the code changes to the parking regulations.
Okay. Okay, I see. Others, let's see. Did you have your light on now? Okay. Sorry, this is still not lining up quite, so Commissioner Gardias, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. Thank you, all of you, specifically from Ventura, for coming to us and sharing your concerns. So a couple of comments. I generally agree with the report, but
excuse me, Commissioner Gardias, we're doing questions first. So if you have any questions of these, then we're going to do a comments round.
Yes, I will have questions.
Okay.
But let me just start with the preamble, if you don't mind, right? So we all did, so why wouldn't I? So, but however, right? This is one of many reports that we've seen, and they are consistent. They're all the same, and I mean, we can always question the point more or less, but pretty much this is the same spread of the numbers. So I think that it's really hard to question the numbers. What I would be looking for, I would be looking for something that's truly going to provide different perspective on parking. Because I don't believe that this is the right question that we're asking. Of course, we can drive the parking utilization lower. We can just go with those numbers and reduce these numbers. And I'm sure that people will comply because they will have no no other option. So there is no question about this, that we can do this. However, there are different questions that need to be answered. And that is pretty much a question about the cost. At what cost we are doing this? So, for example, when my colleagues talk about spillover and then counting cars at night, right? So there needs to be, when we are doing a survey of different buildings, then of course we would like to verify how many cars park in the neighborhood from this facility. And we're talking not only about the cars of the residents, we're also talking about some cars of those who visit of the visitors of those residents. That those visitors may not be at night, they may be in the evening hours or during the day, but certainly there is some sort of number that needs to be quantified. Once I worked to one of the affordable housing here on Alma, and I just talked to one of the residents. I asked the question, what do you do if you don't have a parking stall? And she told me that, oh, you park on the street. And then I went also at night. It wasn't 2:30 in the morning. It was like 10:30 at night. It's in the evening. So, and they do indeed park on the street. You can just go outside and you can see that pretty much there's a number of them. They live in the morning. They really don't need to have the parking space. They park on the streets here within the downtown, and then pretty much they leave to work. And then return after 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock. So I would be looking for some understanding of the spillover effect. Where those other cars go? I think that pretty much it should be included in the count, and understand how it impacts the neighborhoods, how it impacts also ability of the residents to park in front of their houses. There is somewhere at one point when we had our discussions, my colleague Michael, and I probably should be using the official title, Commissioner Alczek. In the recent meeting minutes, I said Jonathan, and somebody corrected me to use Mr. Light as opposed to Jonathan. So he said something that was very interesting, right? So he said that we suggest that streets, that parking on the streets, something like this, is limited only for some to use, which is not true, right? Streets are open for all of them. However, there needs to be some study that pretty much looks into utilization of the street, so we can understand if we can understand the spillover effect and also using of those street parking spaces, how it impacts neighborhoods, and what's the cost, at what cost of the residents if they have to park their cars somewhere else, or they have to park on their property when they expect to park in front of their house, as opposed to parking in their driveway. So I would like to include in the study some novelty approach to this, and a couple of other comments. When in your studies there's a number of different graphs. Can I continue or not? Okay, so just maybe then a couple of other comments. So, in your studies, there's number of the numbers. For example, on page 17, there is a change from 2000 to 2016. How commuting to work uses different modes of transportation and how it changed. It just shows these numbers, and then in the body of the handout, there is an explanation that's around these numbers, but there is no study about what is causing this change. And I was trying to understand the very essential question, why, and it's not there. So if you look, for example, at chart 1, I'm sorry, I'm going to take another couple of minutes. It just shows that pretty much from 2000 to 2016, that number of the residents that drive solo dropped from 75% to 65%, which means by giving the population growth that either some people gave up their cars, or pretty much that usage of the newcomers or the new residents moving to Palo Alto, their prevailing propensity is to use other modes of transportation. So one of those two, or maybe some combination. I'm saying only this because I would like to understand why. And this study, nor the report, they don't provide any explanation for me to understand what's going on.
So you're into the comments now, and that's what we're going to go to next. So if you could just hold the rest of your comments until
Thank
you
you.
get a turn on that. So folks you had a question? Okay.
Chair's been giving us 5 minutes, so I'll probably take the full 5 minutes, so I might ask my questions quickly. I'm noticing that there's a tension in the code between the ability to increase our housing production and preserve retail, and it's, impacting decision-making. So if we want to keep retail, how can we do so in a manner that won't discourage housing production? Are there examples of accepting the first, 1,000 or so square foot, things like that? Can you speak to that briefly, or when we get to that section, could I ask that you address it then?
Sure, I'll address it briefly now so you can get your
Thanks.
5 minutes. So yes, you have some provisions for shared parking if there's a nexus between retail uses that might need more demand during the day and residential uses that could use that space in the evening. I mentioned in the report an idea of exempting the first 1,500 or 2,000 square feet of retail, which is commonly done in cities, which may be appropriate. And then also, we discussed this last month, but thinking about where is retail really most important, and are there places where 100% retail projects would be appropriate and you don't need that ground floor retail?
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to Ventura, what I understand is happening in Ventura is that you're having a lot of homes where maybe adult children are moving home, or more people are living in homes than traditionally anticipated for that neighborhood, and so there's more cars per household, and that's just from some people that I've heard. There's other issues going along as well. So I think looking at parking for the city, we have to just also look at what's going on in the actual neighborhoods and what's driving it. Do we need to look at parking requirements in the R1 or R2 area? And maybe those need to be increased, and maybe they need to be decreased near transit, like as an inverse relationship. So I think I would encourage staff to find out more about what's going on in that particular neighborhood and address those concerns. In regards to the presentation about housing production, it looks like the barrier is twofold in that it's cost and form, and the form was the planning and massing that you had mentioned too, Jeannie. Can you explain how the parking affects the form? Because if we were to reduce the parking requirement, also, how do we know that that would be passed along to the consumer?
So with respect to form, I mentioned the issues. There's requirements for driveway widths, the backup areas, and then of course the actual number of parking spaces for both the residential uses and the guest spaces. And so that's just one of the major drivers when we're thinking about all of those development standards that compose how you can build out the envelope of a site. Parking is one that's really driving that site planning, and therefore how many units you can actually get on the site. The other biggest one that we talked about last month is FAR. In terms of the costs, that's not something we control, how if you're building less parking on the site and the developer's spending less on that, we can't control what the financial outcome is for how that gets passed along, but we would expect that can actually increase the unit yield that you can get on the site, and that's really our focus here is increasing housing production, so getting more units on the site. And in the little example I showed of the 3-unit project, a 4 or 5 unit building on a site, those units in one apartment building are going to be less expensive just by design than 3 standalone single-family homes would be.
All right, thanks for clarifying that. On page 18, there's a hypothetical about the state density bonus, but I'm not really seeing an example of what it would take to build something like that and how feasible that would be.
So yeah, Palo Alto doesn't seem to see a lot of state density bonus projects. You see them a lot in San Francisco and the East Bay. Developers use it a lot as a mechanism to get additional units on a site, get additional bonus density. I did mention the feedback that I got from some stakeholders, which is that they want to be 100% compliant with the code. And that's sort of out of respect for the process that you have and the zoning ordinance that you have. And in other communities, I think you just don't.
Yeah, I know
see
you
that
mentioned that. I
approach.
guess I didn't know what you meant by that. 100% compliant with
So they
Palo
would-
Alto's
With
code?
Palo Alto's development standards. So in this case, if you're applying for a project under state density bonus law, and you're an eligible project, you can ask for, and the city cannot deny, you use of these reduced parking standards. But you don't really have, I think there was one example of a project taking advantage of that, but you're not seeing it much.
Okay, and then are there strategies being employed elsewhere that maximize housing production without increasing parking on the streets? Like,
I've seen this, and I wouldn't recommend it, but there are communities that exclude new multifamily developments from their RPP version of their programs. It's sort of if you come in later and you're a new project, then you can be excluded from that residential permit parking requirement. You can make judgments about whether that's a good or a bad idea, but that's something that I've seen.
I do have a couple quick questions, if I could, regarding peak demand.
You're talking very fast. It's
Yes.
good. Continue.
Regarding peak demand, it looks like you're explaining that on page 15, and I just want to make sure I understand it. Because I thought I heard earlier that you were taking very conservative figures and coming up with peak demand. Is that what you were talking about, the 85%? Can you just explain how you come up with peak demand? Make sure I understand it correctly.
So there's two different kinds of peak demand. So one is when we do the surveys, we do them at different times of the day to find the time that has the highest or peak demand. And then when we, like in the report, when I present the conclusions, those were, of the three different types, I would present the highest rate per bedroom, not the average of the three sites.
So with that, you're basically saying that, for example, on page 15, that at the worst case scenario, when everyone's there, when all the cars are there, there's still 20% parking that's not utilized on that one case example.
That's great. That's right.
So that seems pretty compelling to me from a data standpoint. Do you have any criticisms of your own approach or your own data collection where you could have seen areas of improvement or more thoroughness?
Well, I do want to double check to make sure that we also included the overflow parking on the street, because the idea is to collect the total demand, not just the demand on the site. So that's one thing I want to come back and check.
Yeah, I think everyone would want to hear about that. And you talked about green trips data. Can you just tell us what data you acquired? Or is that in your report? Maybe I didn't see it. And if you have anything on green trips that you can enlighten this commission about.
So do you know the organization Transform?
I do. I've heard of green trips, but I don't think it hasn't been presented to this commission.
So Transform is an agency, and they're really trying to reduce vehicle trips and reduce vehicle parking demand. That's kind of their mantra. But they do have an on-site, they do have a website that has parking data. And so it's just in here as information for your consideration, and it's data, they have information on the location of the complex, whether or not it's affordable or what % of it is affordable, the type of location, whether or not it's kind of more urban or more suburban, the parking rate, the parking supply rate, the parking demand rate, and then they also have some information on why the parking demand rate may be lower, like if they have like really great bicycle parking programs, if it's near transit and things like that. So
are you looking at a particular page in the report?
So if you, in my report on page 5.
Okay.
And then I just pick out some examples from that database.
So that's different from green trips.
It's called Transform Green. They call their database Green Trip.
Oh, okay. I thought there's a different organization. All right. Question for staff. When was our parking requirements set forth? I think it was in the report. I just don't recall. In the 70s, something? 80s?
So in 2003, the city updated its code to implement the 1998 comp plan, and that established parking standards for land use and standards for different uses. I don't know if that meant that the actual standards changed. It's just when the ordinance was reconfigured, it was previously by use and district, and now it's all in one section.
Thank you.
But it was based on the 98 plan.
Okay. Okay, very good. Are there any other burning questions that somebody gets in? Otherwise, we'll just go on to comments, and this could take longer, but let's try the 10 minutes. If it doesn't work, we'll just have to expand it, and we can come back for another round. So light up the board if you'd like to make comments on, in general, your perceptions here, direction that you'd like council to, staff to address, and so on. So Commissioner Gardias is lit up.
Thank you. I have a question to staff. So because this is preparation for the ordinance that we will see, in a month or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more like the end of summer, where we might come back in July with some, basic parameters of an ordinance, but we're not drafting language specifically for next month.
We're not.
We're not going to have an ordinance for the commission to look at next month. We'll have concepts that we would want to translate into an ordinance that we would return in August.
Will it be, because the reason that I'm asking, because I think that there's a number of the related factors. Of course, we can restrict parking by some degree, but then there is a transportation element, getting to the job. So I was wondering if that ordinance would be connected with some other transportation elements, or it would be solely from perspective of reducing parking. The reason is that if we reduce demand, right, we might just need to think about just increasing supply of transportation means, if that's possible. So how comprehensive that would?
Yeah. So I think there's this ordinance that we're contemplating, and it's not drafted at this point. This builds on a dialogue that we've started with the commission, and there's a lot of different levers that we're looking at to see what could be modified to encourage housing production, which is we understand to be the stated objective of the council, and so that's what we're looking to advance. Parking is certainly one of those components, but before this meeting, you had a conversation about other aspects, unit density and floor area and process and other matters. So we'll be looking at those things too in an ordinance that comes back to the commission. With respect to transportation-specific items, our code already has some language about TDMs and when they're required, and so we have that as a standard. And we are also going back to the City Council in August with a transportation impact fee that we are hoping to get advanced, which will adjust our current program and establish some new requirements for housing development or any development that is subject to that ordinance. So I think there's multiple efforts underway. They may not all be reflected in the ordinance that we are presenting to the commission at the end of the summer.
But you're saying that there are a lot of interrelated items, which is what Commissioner Gardias is saying, and to get to more housing, we've got a lot of levers that we can pull. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we're exploring and hoping to move forward.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you very much. This was of course, from the housing perspective, how to mitigate shortage of housing. My question was around how we can make travel to work and back home easier in absence of cars, right? And that element is missing to me, and I understand that maybe we have limited abilities to pretty much intervene in the market and then increase or improve the the frequency of buses or frequency of Caltrain or some other transportation means. I totally get it, right? I was wondering if there's some other element considered in conjunction with parking reduction that would allow people to transport flexibly to different places of work where they choose to be employed.
Right, and I think what you're articulating is something that is sort of the grand idea that we're trying to advance, and we do have our recently adopted comprehensive plan. We have our bike and pedestrian plan that we're implementing, and so I think all those different efforts are underway to be implemented to help us move us closer to our goal. This ordinance, though, just so we can establish expectations, would not solve that problem. This is just one, this is a multi-year effort, and even at the conclusion of that multi-year effort that the council adopted with this housing work program, the goals that you've articulated, I think, extend beyond the horizon of this effort. Those are long-term objectives that we're trying to accomplish.
It may be so, but I still have concern that if we reduce parking supply, then we pretty much may reduce a freedom of the citizenry that will live in these houses. We may reduce their ability to work in different locations, because some locations may be distant. They may require cars or various means, and then pretty much they will be stuck. And if there's a recession come, it may even worsen some social. It may impact some social problems. So. For this reason, I'm just looking carefully into this, and there are some shorter-term opportunities. We talked, for example, about reaching out to the neighboring municipalities and connecting TMA efforts. That would be pretty much low-hanging fruit from my perspective. Just connecting, working with Mountain View to pretty much extend transportation between our two cities. I don't think this is long-term. I think this is a short-term, and That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Commissioner Sumo?
Just one more quick question. When you do traffic studies, do you always count, and I'll say it's a snapshot because that's kind of what it was. Do you always do it that way where you count a observed snapshot vacancy as correlating to an oversupply of parking spots? Is that the way it's always done?
Yes, but I also wanted to say that we also get information on the occupancy of the units at the apartment complex as well. So they're mostly fully occupied.
Right. I noticed that that they were all more or less fully occupied, so that wouldn't have made a significant difference. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
You can keep the floor if you want to do your comments now, because we're on the comments round.
Okay. So, I'm uncomfortable with the whole approach of increasing housing through under-parking buildings, and that's kind of what I think this would result in. I mean, by your methodology, if you had gone to my house between last Thursday, when I was observing most of the sites, between 11 and 2:30, you would have said, hey, they have too much parking at that house. Now, it's a single-family home, so you wouldn't have gone there, but I just don't understand that a temporary vacancy correlates or demonstrates an oversupply of parking. I can see if there were tremendous differences, and if it was observed in a more rigorous manner, then I would find it more convincing, actually. And I think we have such a parking problem in this city already, and it's, not everybody experiences it the same way, that I'm very uncomfortable with this approach, and I find a lot of the arguments to not be making a lot of sense. And one I'll call out in your memorandum is relates to automated vehicles, and it's a simple statement you make that Next generation vehicles that operate with or without a driver aboard will be available in the next few years. They will likely be provided as a subscription service and would not need a residential parking space. So all the studies that I have heard, and I have some personal conversations to rely upon because my husband just left Uber. He was the director of market data science, and I read him this, and he said, no, that's ridiculous. And he literally said, that's if the parking ferries are at work, because if it ever happens, a lot of people in the industry think that if it ever becomes a widely adopted model of transportation, it could take 30 years or more. And there's a lot of problems associated with it that I think have been demonstrated lately, such as the difficulty of computer systems recognizing human beings that are in front of them, which tragically happened in Arizona. So it's really not, the industry has not decided which model, if this ever becomes massively embraced, and it could be in some parts of the world and not other parts of the world, and it could just be for big cities. There's no understanding yet of whether it would be individually owned ones, and there is no understanding yet in that industry of whether they would be owned by people who own fleets. But the one thing is, there is an understanding that at the peak demand, which from moving people around in cars is always in the morning, that you would want to have the vehicles, whether they're personally owned or owned by people who own fleets, near the people that were sleeping, so they would be close by when they left their houses, whether it's to work or school or whatever it is. And so it's very unclear to me how we can rely, and I've said this before from up here, how we can rely on unproven, unknown technologies. We don't even know if that's going to end up being the main model going forward. So that is troubling to me. A lot of the ideas are in here are really good. I would like to see people using lifts. I think it makes parking much more affordable for developers. I would like to see a process. I do not believe in-lieu parking has been a great success. We don't have any not one single study that shows how well TDM are working. Our recently departed director of planning told me that directly. There are no studies. So at this point, we can't rely on those. And I think that though, like many things, there are going to be some winners and losers, and our one neighborhoods and our two neighborhoods will not be affected, but all the other neighborhoods would be. And I was very moved by a member of the public who's no longer here that even thought there was sort of an unfair, perhaps racial component to this, and maybe racial's not the correct word, but that some neighborhoods have a lot more renters and a lot more recent immigrants and a lot more first-time homeowners or renters, and that they would be unduly hurt by this. And I don't see how it's solving a problem that we have. And that problem is our jobs housing imbalance, which was created by producing way too much office and the jobs that go along with them compared to the housing. So for me, this study, with the combination of chart 1 in the memorandum and chart 3 on packet page 14, proves that we shouldn't be reducing the parking one bit for multifamily housing. So I'm sort of surprised by it. And I could make a lot more comments, but I will leave it at that and let my colleagues speak.
Others with comments? Commissioner Monk?
I very much appreciate Commissioner Suma's perspectives. I have a slightly different perspective, and I was out to dinner last week with another couple, and the husband lifted up his phone and he said, "This is my car." And you just can't ignore statements like that, because this is a person who chose to commute from his home in Los Gatos to San Francisco, then chose to commute from San Francisco to Palo Alto to meet us for dinner via Lyft or Uber or whatever rideshare he's using. He's more than happy to use it. And so I think we can't ignore those trends, and although we might have issues with what's presented in the report, and it's not there yet, it's going in that direction. So I just want to point that out, that we do need to be cognizant of those sorts of trends. And myself included in that, I live less than 2 blocks from here in a 2-bedroom condo. We have 2 parking spaces. We really didn't need 2 cars because I can walk everywhere. Walk to Whole Foods, I walk to restaurants, post office, to City Hall. That's where I choose to live because I like those amenities. I think in your report you referred to that as self-selection on page 14. And so I think folks in that category expect a certain level of congestion and more intense parking circumstances. And I think my overall issue with our approach to parking as it has been is that we're looking at this citywide, and we're not looking at this by the various neighborhoods. And I think that's something that we really should evaluate, and I think that we can't ignore that fact. I think there's a higher threshold for people that are living in these denser, more transit-oriented cores as compared to folks that are living in your more residential R1 neighborhoods. And to put the same requirements in those 2, or more than 2 circumstances just doesn't seem appropriate, and I think we need to be a bit more progressive in our overall approach. The issue that we're talking about today is the impact, or the negative impact, that the current residential parking requirements have on housing production and to some extent affordability. So just separating those 2 things out, it's not just whether or not they're affordable or not, or making them more affordable by not having parking. It's the entire envelope that we're talking about as far as in terms of actually producing more housing by not having the parking there or lessening it. So I find that the data presented in the report seems comprehensive enough to me to suggest that at least in the multifamily units that are near transit are not being utilized to the extent that they were built for, and I would support reducing parking requirements proposed at the 20 or 25% rate within a half mile of transit based on the evidence that you presented to us. There were 4 other points you brought up in your presentation, I think, Jean, and so I do support those. I liked what Mr. Lewinsky said about streets should be looked at, and I think a lot of people mentioned that as well, and I think that needs to happen when the report comes back to us, particularly in regards to paid parking downtown. And I don't think that's within your purview, but that was something that sort of peeked its head before the commission and then kind of went and hid. I don't know where it is right now, but we do need to look at the streets. In regards to the study not involving residents, I feel like this is a data-driven study, and it should be driven by the experts who know how to collect and analyze data. Whether or not we're choosing the right vendors, whether or not using the right mechanisms, we have a democratic process to point that out, bring it up. I think that's why we have this public forum. So I don't know that residents are going to be collecting data, and I don't think they have a role in that. What I think is valuable is that they're coming and they're sending us letters, they're coming and they're presenting their positions here, and we're hearing them in this format, and we're vetting all of those concerns before this goes to council. So hopefully that when you present to council, you'll have a sense of what to expect in terms of the community sentiment. And so I think there is value in that, and I'm not critical of the study not reaching out directly to residents in that regard. I think it's just ultimately an issue of trust and finding the right vendors that we can rely on as a commission, and I rely on staff to choose the right people to do the reports, but I also appreciate the opportunity for people to comment and criticize. I think that's the beauty of our democracy. I just had a few of those points at this juncture, but I have more I'll go to later on. Thanks.
Okay, others? Let's see, Commissioner Waldvogel.
Thank you. So just so we don't lose sight of the broader issue, tonight's report is on parking, which is one of the knobs that we can turn to stimulate the residential development in the commercial districts. But a work product that I'd like to see from the stakeholder interviews is a financial model for development. Because in mixed-use districts where office commands twice the rent that market rate residential commands, I'm not convinced that parking is the real cost, or the parking cost is the real issue that's deterring residential development. So I'd like to see financial models, and I'd like to see models, I'd like to see a spreadsheet model where we can put parking ratios, and we can put, we can turn FAR knobs, we can turn lot coverage knobs. I think those are the big knobs that we could turn in a model. But I'd like to see a model because, I mean, I've heard Commissioner Alcheck doesn't like anecdotes. I'll give you an anecdote. I built a model, and in my model, when I zeroed out the parking requirements, office was still more profitable than residential. So I think we need some professionally built models to vet whether we're talking about the number 1 issue or the number 4 issue tonight. The place where I'm stuck on the report is that the census data just contradicts the F&P counts. There's just no consistency, and I'd like to see those inconsistencies reconciled. I mean, I just did a quick look, again, looking at some of the census data. I mean, looking at that same chart 3, and if you actually take the numbers, you get every 100 households generate 175 vehicles. And then if you take some other numbers in the census report and set them against parking rates that are required in the current code would require 190 spaces for those 175 generated vehicles. So we're actually pretty close to right if the census data is right. So there's just giant inconsistencies here that we have to reconcile before we push this forward. The counts just don't add up relative to the census data. They also don't add up relative to the DMV data. I've looked at the DMV data, and the DMV data actually shows growth in vehicles in operation in Palo Alto over the last 8 years, actually fairly substantial growth. So there's a bunch of different data sets. The hard thing with doing data-driven analysis is really normalization and reconciling the data. It's whether you do averages, it's whether you do linear regression. I mean, there's a lot of tools that you can run against it. And I'm just not sure that we've got the A-team doing the analysis here. So I think we need to step up and try to reconcile all the different sources. I'd also like to echo something that Commissioner Suma just mentioned about the in-loop program. I've asked staff several times now for some reporting on the in-loop program. Since it's in the report, I think it's appropriate. You're proposing to potentially expand it. Before we do that, we really need a study session on the in-loop program because we really need to know, with the existing program, how many spaces have been paid in? What's the backlog? What's the median age of the spaces that have not been built in the program? How much was paid in per space? And what's the actual cost in the budgeted garages? I mean, is the in-loop program actually working? I mean, until we know that, I think it's rash to even contemplate extending it. It may be that we need to suspend it for commercial projects until we actually catch up to the backlog. And that may be a way to put commercial and residential on a more equal footing. But I think that talking about expanding the in-loop program before we've seen any of the statistics on how it's performed just seems very rash. I'd just like to ask staff, do we actually have that data? I mean, is data available on how many spaces have been paid in through the in-loop programs in the parking assessment districts? And I mean, is that data that can be supplied to us?
It might be data that can be derived. I don't know that that's data that is actively collected in terms of the number of parking spaces. We collect a fee, and the fee gets put into an account, and there'd be some kind of calculation to sort of back into the number. But
presumably the fee is calculated because a project is supposed to generate X spaces, and then that's translated into a fee. But do we ever keep track of the X?
Well, I'm not sure what the X is in that equation, but we do know what the fee, we do have a fee that we charge for the in-loop parking spaces that somebody would be eligible to apply for. So,
But do we know the number of spaces that have not been built and that have been paid for as in lieu instead?
I'm sorry, so that's what I was trying to get at before. So no, we don't have a direct answer. I mean, we don't maintain a data set that I'm aware of for each one of those projects that may have sought a in lieu space. We collect a fee, and then we would have to go through over time all the contributions to that account, and then
So how do we know that those in lieu fees are actually comparable with the cost of developing the parking spaces? I mean, if a developer can get a good deal by paying an in lieu fee and not building the spaces, that's a bad deal for the citizens.
Yeah, I understand that. And our code in Title 16 does set forth the process by which the fee is set. And so that's what we have. I mean, I think that is a fair comment and one that we should probably be looking at in terms of how we are assessing that fee and how that's keeping up with the cost of construction.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I just think that we, before we even contemplate expanding that program, we should at least study it and see if it's performing as we expect. Thanks. Those are all my comments at this point.
Okay, I have a few. One of mine you just actually stated very well, which is that we have a lot of levers we can pull, and the whole thing is just we need more housing. So, for example, I think that the suggestion of relaxing retail standards, if that really turns the dial to get a housing project up, particularly affordable housing, which is my next point, I'd be very open to that. And we already have some examples of retail that's not working anyway. But we really need to get the housing inventory up, not the office inventory up. So the types of incentives that we give to developers should obviously incent that. And if Commissioner Waldfogel's numbers show that taking parking out still makes office that much more profitable, then we need to get our pencils out and figure out some other things. So then the second thing I want to make is that I'll always want to keep remembering our priority that we set here starting last year in the comp plan and so on, and that's around BMR and affordable housing. So I still believe personally very strongly that that should be our emphasis. I understand that council is saying we need more housing for everything, but I wouldn't put market rate housing first. And I don't think we did in the last year and a half. So to the extent that we can incent more folks that, whether that's teachers or policemen or whoever, can live here, so we have diversity as a value in our city, that is how I think we should prioritize it. Obviously, seniors are in there as another sort of deserving group, but I wouldn't be emphasizing all this for market rate housing, because people are going to find market rate housing. Thirdly, as was emphasized actually in a couple of times, but also got a letter where points out that Caltrans officials said about the Stanford GUP, there's no assurance that Caltrans in the future will be able to meet Stanford's stated reliance on them to meet needs of commuting employees, students, and faculty. So we just can't duck this. We do not have good mass transportation here, anywhere. So we're stepping into that. We hope that improves, just like we hope that TDMs improve, and we hope that there are more autonomous vehicles and that the trend, gets big. But right now, all we have is data that says that 97% of Palo Altans like to drive their cars. And the other stuff is more speculation. So I'm personally open to making adjustments downward consistent with, on parking constraints, consistent with, council direction that that's a way. But I just think that we ought to be taking collectively a close look at what are the best ways that you get real bang for the buck on getting more affordable housing in here. I'll just leave it there. Let's see, Commissioner Alchek?
Okay. It's true. I really don't. I don't like the anecdotes. And it goes both ways. Just because a former Uber employee says it does, executive says it, doesn't make it true. And a friend at a restaurant suggesting, there doesn't, that sort of information isn't quite reliable enough. for us to make land use planning decisions on. And I'm very encouraged by a process that is more data-driven. I think in a political process like this one, if you don't like the data, you can attack the data. And that's just the way we do things now. That's the way everybody approaches almost everything that we do in stateside. So I'll just suggest that I think the reason why mid-rise residential cannot compete with office in Palo Alto is because the playing field isn't level. I think that is precisely the essence of the information that was presented to us a month ago. I think our last meeting on this topic was about how the playing field isn't level and how there are incentives that create greater flexibility for commercial development, and that creates disincentives for the development of residential. We are absolutely in one of the most expensive residential areas in the United States. I think I just want to acknowledge something that you said, and the notion that developers are underutilizing housing bonus eligibility out of respect for the Palo Alto process is unbelievable. I think something was lost in translation there. So I'll leave it at that. There's something, that sentence doesn't work for me. I think we need to really dig deep to understand. There may be an issue that state density bonuses go hand in hand with affordable housing, and affordable housing is very politically unfavorable in the process. And so as a result, people are just not going that direction. It might be the commercial code. There might be a number of issues, but I don't think that they're avoiding opting for bonuses as a result of the process. I'll go through it, and you can kind of get back to that one if you want. I think there's something there that I missed. I think many residents, I think there's a lot of residents who would agree that our current parking standards, perfect, and specifically with housing, perfectly epitomize the concept of low-hanging fruit in our effort to address the housing crisis. So I'm hoping that when staff comes to us the next opportunity, that we really sort of explore all the different opportunities we have to fix those standards. And I would suggest to staff, I would request that you please give us the opportunity to sort of debate the spectrum. And what do I mean by that? I would implore you to find the most aggressive approaches in the Bay Area. I'm not suggesting you go much farther, but if you would like to, please, and present them to us. Reach out to the planners in some of the local agencies that have really aggressive parking approaches for housing, and ask them, please ask them why and what's been working. I think it would be incredible to have a discussion next time around where you said, you know, we talked to some senior planners in San Jose where they have basically a zero parking requirement when it comes to residential in their downtown, and here's what they saw. Did it immediately result in greater development? I think that our planning department is acutely aware of just how many little things would we need to fix to sort of level the playing field. I think the reason why we separated this one out, I suspect the reason why this one was separated out is because this is low-hanging fruit. If our data is demonstrating that our parking standards are greater than necessary, then let's adjust them so that we don't create hurdles that are expensive and problematic for the housing development. So again, any effort, I think, to better align our parking to housing types, proximity to transit, geography, I think we should be pursuing that with gusto. And I don't even, I think there's a lot of suggestion, there's a lot of ideas sort of broached in this packet, I think one of the best uses of our time would be to identify some of the obvious ones and then reach out to our neighbors, some of the cities that are a little more effective in their approach, and ask. I just think, I don't know. I don't know if that's a common practice in planning departments for, senior staffers to call each other, but look, we're in a crisis. Our agencies should probably be talking to each other. I'm sure someone would welcome the opportunity to talk. I hope that somehow our city can create a little bit of a budget for our staff members to meet someone over there and ask them, how is this working? Is it working? What kind of results are you seeing in terms of the spurring of housing development? Two things happened since our last meeting, right? We got this report, which I believe suggests that there is a future for car-light housing. And the second thing that happened at the May Fet Parade, and I'm raising this because it was brought up last time. At the May Fet Parade, I ran into PAEA. They had a booth, the Palo Alto Educators Association. They represent the certified employees of the Palo Alto Unified School District with 900 members. Exclusively, they represent them exclusively. And the reason why I mention it is because they came up, I met one of their leaders at a booth very randomly, and I mentioned the Planning Commission role came up, and the first thing that they mentioned was that housing is a critical issue for their employment. And so that was something that we touched on last meeting. And I just want to highlight that the goal here is to encourage housing. If this is one lever and it's out of whack, let's correct. And I think in order to have a healthy debate, we should see a real spectrum. So I would assume that the current standard is the most aggressive version of doing nothing. And we should also know what cities who are approaching a completely opposite side of the spectrum are finding with their policy. And then I'll just address, I think tonight, we heard Mr. Weiss suggest that the world looks to Palo Alto for leadership in many industries, and I always take pride in that, right? We all do. We are very proud residents, but I don't think that's necessarily true about our land use strategies. I don't think the world is looking to us for our land use planning approaches, and that's not, to suggest that our city staff isn't exemplary. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves that historically, our, peninsula planning departments have been used too often, right? Exploited too often to exclude rather than include, right? And I mention that because I think we should turn that around. And I'm really hopeful that our city and its staff will really reach much higher and present our leadership with, the sort of actionable opportunities that can make us the sort of city that people would say, wow, they're really addressing their land use crisis in a way that we should all be taking note of. And so I really am happy about this report. I was, until we received it, I had no idea to what extent, we were looking at these things. I think we should not ignore this information. And I don't know when the date is that we're going to look at this again. But I guess it would help if I knew in advance, for example, there's no real protocol for us to contact the City of San Jose Planning Department and talk to them. If there doesn't seem to be a way to sort of bridge the gap between the agencies that are doing things a little more aggressively than us, I'd be happy to do it. I'm volunteering my time here anyways with a goal of creating effective and promising change for housing. And so if there's a way for me to set up a meeting with a planning commissioner in San Jose or even planning staff, I'll do it. So if that seems unreasonable, if that request seems like something outside of the wheelhouse, let me know, email me, and I'll try to do it so that at least we can get some more information and sort of push the ball down the road.
Okay, thank you. Any others with comments in this round? Yeah, we've all had our or in on both questions and comments. So a question at this point would be, do you want to, tonight, take up any of the specific items and, deal with them? For example, portion of ground floor retail, or things like that? Or is this enough to set the stage and staff has enough direction that we could pick that up later? So it's a question both to staff and to any commissioner that would like to comment.
Can I just respond to your question? I'll just say that my preference would be not to straw vote ideas tonight, because I'd like, if staff's planning to come back to us with 15 options, I'd hate to eliminate one tonight. I'd rather have that list be exhaustive than limited based on tonight's discussion.
Yeah, I get it. That makes sense. Sorry, Commissioner Suma? Sorry, you're next.
Yeah, and I thought tonight was really about this parking study. In the what we would do with retail seems kind of a different conversation. And with regards to reducing drive lanes for multi-family housing and those specific, and even the size of parking spots, I think we would need more a discussion just on that so we could really understand it. Because I thought drive lanes and turning ratios and widths and stuff, I thought that was sort of kind of written in stone, because you can't make them smaller and have things be safe and have people move around. So I would almost think we need to discuss those things on their own.
Okay, Commissioner Monk?
I have an observation about the report, and it kind of follows with what Commissioner Suma was saying in regards to that specific issue, and that, the report identifies five I don't know what you call them, sections, I guess, issues, but they're not framed as issues, and you're giving information. It says key issues, but they're not framed as issues. They're framed pretty objectively, in my viewpoint. You're just talking about trends in car ownership in item 1. You're talking about state density bonus in item 3. You're not really putting out action items or scenarios that we can opine on in the way that it's presented, and I'm guessing that's intentional. So if you want us to go over any of those 5 points more in depth, if we haven't received enough, then we could. I just wanted to just point that out, that I thought I couldn't do much with the information as it was presented as far as giving greater input, if that stirs up anything.
I don't think we're looking for any more conversation on the issues. The strategies are some of the areas that we've identified as possibly benefiting from further dialogue. I think we've heard some strong remarks about the in-lieu parking programs. We've talked about not addressing single-family and two-family residential properties. What's left on our key strategies then is sort of this, is there some threshold by which we would reduce parking requirements for multifamily developments, and this consideration of retail. And I think those might be areas that we could benefit from a little bit further dialogue. But maybe before we do, I just would like to offer a few other comments when the time's right.
Yeah, and just with respect to the current schedule, which, as we know, is fluid, I think it's scheduled to come back in June 27th. Was there another comment from
and
staff?
I guess on top of that, the other thing I would want to explore is this height limit situation. I know that hasn't something that you put forward to the stakeholders. I don't think it is. If it is, let us know. But I'm seeing that wasn't presented as an option, and even though it's mentioned in our comp plan as an option.
For tonight, we're just talking about parking.
But wouldn't that have an impact on the ability to increase housing production if they could go up beyond the 50 feet in certain areas and certain circumstances?
Yeah,
Or if there's a retail requirement?
absolutely. But again, tonight's focus is really just about parking. We wanted to keep the topic isolated to the parking question. So yes, we will.
So it's not a reasonable question to say, hey, if you went up 10 feet,
We've been asking, yeah, I think Jeannie's been talking to stakeholders about height, but again, we've tried not to get into that conversation tonight, right? Because we're just really talking about parking right now.
okay. It to me seems tied to the ability.
Well, everything's tied together, right? The whole conversation that we had the month before and parking and height. And I mean, we could spend, I mean, Jeannie could speak to it right now if that's the,
I'd be
commission's
interested
interest.
to hear what they say about it, if it's a factor or not.
So that was one of the more mixed responses. Some stakeholders thought it was limiting in terms of the yield they can get on the site, and others said it wasn't, that really it was parking and floor area ratio that were the limiting factors. So I think some of it depends where you are, what district you're in, what type of project you have. But it was just one of those things where it wasn't really conclusive. And so you'll see that when we come back with the stakeholder summary report.
All right, thank you very much.
Commissioner Walfogel?
Yeah, just one other request, as and Jeannie, as you look at this, in all the other uses in the mixed-use districts, the parking regulations are by 1,000 feet of development, and I wonder whether a standard like that would work in residential, rather than thinking about it per bedroom. But I mean, I've been just been running some simple models, but I wonder if you could just explore that. Look at some ideas on number of spaces per 1,000 as opposed to number of spaces per bedroom, and if that would get to approximately the right yield and make it more comparable, make it easier to compare residential and commercial development costs, that might be productive.
Yeah, you don't typically see communities do that, partly because, here we've got 4,000 square foot units.
Well, yeah, you'd probably need an adjuster when you get above a certain size.
I think, and maybe Jane can speak to this, but, Palo Alto does it by bedroom. Some cities regulate parking by unit, but those tend to be better predictors of demand than a per square footage calculation.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to just model it. I mean, I think that you'd got nearly the same fit as you do with per bedroom. If you look at the, anyway, we can talk about this offline.
Assistant Director Lay, did you want to make additional comments?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to suggest that, we're not really expecting and not trying to convince anyone who has a perspective or an opinion about the issue. We don't expect that necessarily would be changed by the report that was transmitted. We do know that there's an interest in having data, and so we made an effort to put that forward, and we understand that, I think it's probably improbable that we would ever produce enough data that would satisfy people who may have an interest in this topic. I wanted to note that the report doesn't single out any neighborhood. Ventura neighborhoods come up a couple of times this evening. This is a general study that talks about residential parking citywide. We had 9 sites that we identified in the city. This isn't. This is a more overview and again a citywide approach, not a neighborhood approach. I appreciate the comments that we've received regarding the study, and there's some questions that have come up, and we'll need to look at that and see if we can address some of those issues. We heard about the census data and maybe taking a closer look at that. The comment about the 94% of the downtown units had one or more cars and how that represented a sort of a floor. We'll take a look at that. Concerns about the spillover parking, and we'll check with our surveyors to understand if that was contemplated or studied when they did this. We heard comments about assigned and unassigned parking spaces, so we'll take a look at that as well and see if that's something that we can't take a look at. And then also getting some feedback from the residents who live in these different areas. Well, these are all things that we'll talk about after the meeting tonight and see if there's some areas where we can't tighten up the report and give some additional information on those areas. We know that from a policy perspective, we know that parking is expensive. We know that there is a cost to parking, even the free parking that we provide on our public streets. We do know from talking to stakeholders and developers that parking does have an impact on development. Just this month, the Bay Area Council Economic Institute released a study for Alameda County that tackles this very issue. And this is a regional problem, and we're all trying to figure it out and the best way to go forward. With respect to Palo Alto, what we're trying to figure out, I guess, from the commission tonight and get some guidance is, we're presenting a range of options, and I'm hearing very clearly that maybe some of them aren't going to advance to council as a recommendation, but we do know that we need to put forward an ordinance this year. We do know that there's different levers that we need to adjust and modify, and we believe that parking is one of the ones that we need to look at. And so to the extent that if we don't look at in lieu parking as an item, and if the parking study that we've presented or modify doesn't provide enough, I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about the parking study tonight, and there's another piece about that is, well, okay, so we can get those comments about the parking study, but is the commission as a whole going to get to a place where parking has a little bit of flexibility to adjust in some way? And if not, then that's fine. The commission doesn't forward a recommendation onto council that touches parking. But it may not be that the parking study gives you the answer to support your recommendation. A lot of this, as people who live in this community, you and I know Commissioner Alchek has talked about anecdotal information, but a lot of, you receive that because you talk to people who live here and you interact with them, and so you receive some information through that, and that will inform some of your recommendations to council. So I guess what I'm getting at is, we're not going to be able to provide you data that you're going to be able to pin your hat on and say, this is it, this is exactly what we're looking for, and now I have confidence in making my recommendation to council. Part of this is going to have to be based on, what you've observed, what you know about this community, what you know about the neighborhoods, and talking to the people who are experiencing the, housing challenges and the parking challenges that we are trying to balance. So I guess with that, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's been a suggestion that we do more studies and more analysis, and I know that's always that's a frequent request that we get, and I don't know that we have the time or the consultant funds to do that additional analysis. But what we can do is, to the extent that we can find the commission's comfort level, if any, in adjusting the parking thresholds for multifamily. If there's something you absolutely need for an assistance in that decision-making process, we'd like to know what that is. If it's, are we able to move the needle in any direction to lower parking? And if not, then maybe that's not an area where we can make a recommendation ultimately to council on this ordinance. But if there is, that'd be helpful to have that dialogue. And I think we've presented two. One is related to retail, and one is related to just generally adjusting the parking numbers for multifamily.
Commissioner Suma?
Also, I was wondering, in your list of things that maybe we didn't feel were in the study, the other thing I was wondering was the effect of a neighborhood that has an RPPP on this, and it was Oak Court. I was concerned about that, and then it's clear that people at Oak Court, so I don't know what it would say. I just think it should be considered. And I think parking is really hard because, like I said, you push it here and it bloops out over there, and it's really hard to do. But I just, and thank you, everybody, but I actually agree with Commissioner Alchek. I don't want to rely on anecdotal evidence, and I felt like this study was too anecdotal for me. So it didn't have a convincing, it wasn't rigorous enough for me. So, and I would I also wonder why staff, I was wondering why staff didn't choose the Lower Mayfield project as one of the affordable ones, because it was just built at a lower, I think it's 25% because of being in the transit district. And I was curious how that one is working out, and I happened to be there at the opening and stuff, and they also have lifts. And I think that would have been a good one to look at, so. And if it's working out there, and I live very close to it, I haven't observed any spillover from that one. So that would be good information to have, especially because we really, really, really want to get it right for affordable housing. And I think that we learned, I think, the main objection to the Wilton project from the people that live closest to it is the parking. It's all about the parking. So I really think it's important to get that right. And if Lower Mayfield got it right, it would be great for us to know that. And the ones I did observe had a ton of spillover parking. I actually, because you can't get into Tan, it's gated. I went next door, there's an affordable project on Arrestradero, and it was, solidly parked in front of it, and only 10 of 90, I think it was, I have all the information here, vacant at that time. So to me, it's just like, how do you know somebody didn't get home? How do you know some of those people didn't get home an hour later, or were on a business trip, or at their...
And we're never going to answer that question. I mean, just so,
Yeah.
so I can lower your expectation, we will never have that answer for you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Monk?
On the issue regarding multifamily parking requirements, I would encourage council to explore adjusting in the area that's in close proximity to transit, the half mile of Caltrain stations, to be more specific. 100% support that. Be curious to see if anyone else on the commission supports that. In the report by staff, there's also a lower parking demand in the senior housing areas. But I thought we had a lower parking requirement for senior housing, or do we not? I don't see that identified here, but if we don't, I think it is a lowered requirement. So I'm not really sure what you're asking in that regard. And I think the Wilton Court project brings up an interesting point, and it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I think we ended up going pretty close to the current requirements on that project. I think the concern is that if we do make a change or an adjustment to the parking requirements, and we're intending it to be in a certain area, but then we go and have an overlay like we did for Wilton Court, then we don't really know what's going to happen. And so if there's a way to put some protections in place so that residents can feel confident that it's not going to reduce parking requirements in areas that would actually impact that neighborhood with excess cars on their streets. And I don't know if that's making sense or not, but I guess limiting it by the Caltrain stations might be a way to do that. And I would maybe go then 0.75 like we did with I would go a little bit further than a half a mile and lower it by what you proposed in the report, which is 0.75 spaces per bedroom for a studio, I guess. I'm looking at packet page 16 and trying to give you input on it, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Is this the kind of detail that you want tonight, this kind of input? That's fine, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
My sense of the general question is I think that over time, that there is, openness on this commission to make some adjustments to that. What they are at this, Commissioner Monk is.
I don't know if anyone else is.
Getting to a level of detail that, needs to be worked. But I think there's that's an option.
Yeah, no, I think we got a sense of the tenor of the commission. So do you feel like there's anything we need?
We have a couple more commissioners that have comments, but I just wanted to mention that.
I guess one thing that might be helpful is on this idea of retail. We've talked about retail and retail policy in Palo Alto, and For mixed-use development, it's sometimes a challenge to provide that commercial base with the residential on top. We're exploring eliminating that requirement, but retail parking adds up to a development too. And so is there some threshold where we might be willing to, for neighborhood
I think there is
commercial?
from the 7 of us here.
I'm sorry?
I think there will be for the 7 of us here in certain circumstances.
So if there's a sense for, again, we're just looking for some direction. We don't want to come back with an ordinance that's completely off the mark, but.
Commissioner Waldfogel's up.
Yeah, I'm flexible about retail. I think we probably need to align the different retail uses better. Right now the code is very complicated about different uses for restaurants versus stores. We need to simplify that, align it, because we've seen cases where developers have not accurately predicted what uses that they'll actually put into a space. So let's avoid those kind of problems going forward. I don't have specific proposals for you today. I'm also flexible, in multifamily, I'm flexible on what the final parking ratios are, although the place where I'm inflexible is anything below 1 space per unit for market rate is a place where I probably won't go because I just don't think the data supports it. I think the data is pretty clear that one space per unit is a place that we need to be at for the foreseeable future. The proximity to transit, I looked at this pretty hard, and I'm actually having trouble gleaning from the data that there's less parking demand. I believe there's less trip generation from units that are close to transit, but I can't see in the data that there's less demand for parking. So I think we just need to get clear in our minds what is actually reduced from proximity to transit. And if it's trip reduction, that's great. It certainly feeds into our VMT goals and our carbon standard goals, but our carbon goals, but it really does absolutely nothing for shifting parking standards. So I'm kind of uncomfortable with just interpreting the data based on what we've seen so far.
Commissioner Elchak?
Yeah. So to respond to your question directly, I would support all of those ideas in your ordinance. I think the retail one sounds incredibly promising. Look, I want you to know that I completely understand where you're coming from when it comes to this notion that you have these constraints: time, budget, you're understaffed, there are this is not the only thing you're working on, and you're overwhelmed. And that providing this sort of data collection is super time consuming. I get it. I understand. I totally heard what you said a minute ago when you said, don't expect the encyclopedia here. But let me just say this. If your objective, and I mean this totally sincerely, if your objective is to lead this department in an effort to help us address this housing crisis, then let's acknowledge that we have heard a lot of anecdotal evidence, and a lot of us have perspectives on this dais about what we've seen in the community and the input, and yet there isn't strong representation here of what I would say is sort of third-party reliable data from developers. So interestingly, tonight there was this interaction, right? Commissioner Monk wanted to hear a little bit more about height, right? I would argue height is not low-hanging fruit. There was varied opinion in your interviews, but what there was not varied opinion about was parking and costs. And yet, that info has not yet persuaded the community's leadership to determine that those are real hurdles that need to be addressed quickly. And so maybe we need to focus a little bit on the data collection so that when you say that you heard across the board about the retail parking requirements and the residential parking requirements were the real reason, not height, which, to be perfectly honest, came as a little bit of a shock to me, that those were unanimously the problem. Like, what you can do to bolster the strength of that information when you communicate it to us, whether it's maybe a transcript of the interaction with the stakeholder, right? Because I don't think that we'll hear that. I don't think I shouldn't say we. I don't think there's enough of that communication happening, so it's difficult for community leaders and volunteers to bring that input into the decision-making process. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I appreciate the constraints on time, but there is some information that, if provided, could significantly improve the decision-making process. And I think to the extent that our objective is to actually accomplish a goal here, then maybe we need to focus on hearing that perspective. I don't know exactly how to recommend doing that, but if every residential developer who's ever done work here is pointing to the same problem, that's enough for me to spend the meeting trying to address that problem. And I think the data collection is an effort to say, maybe they're right. But I feel like we, especially on this commission, very frequently interact with the stakeholders you interviewed. So interestingly, even though you had no interactions with residents, we do that a lot. The individuals that you ended up interacting with, we never speak to. And so I found that set of stakeholders to be incredibly informative. So to the extent that we can get more reliable input from them so that we can make these decisions is the reason why that's what I'm imploring you to do. I'm not suggesting you run around collecting evidence that, you're right, will be invariably rejected for incompleteness, because that goal is really too impossible to achieve.
Commissioner Suma.
So I think there's things we could fix really quickly with retail. One of the problems on Cal Ave that I know retailers are having, it's very specific there compared to downtown. And for instance, for takeout, you have to have one parking spot for every 33 feet. And this is very prohibitive for any flexibility, especially now that the assessment district is closed. There's no flexibility between allowed retail uses on the ground floor there, because when the assessment district was open, you could just pay for more. And now everybody's stuck. And I know that a couple of at least one really welcome business was turned away because they were a takeout place and they couldn't go into what had formerly been a copy shop. So I think that's something, and I actually talked about this with former Director Gittleman before she left. That's something I think we could fix right away, because the lack of flexibility between uses in that district is really, what it's getting us is 7 million gyms, really. It is. So I have a lot of hope that we could fine-tune the retail requirements as well.
Commissioner Monk.
On that note, I was thinking also of Cal Ave and the fact that we are, I believe, still on track to put in a parking structure. We also do have existing parking structures, and so I don't know where the code is in regards to taking that into account in having the retail parking requirements and proximity to major parking structures. We discussed it in regards to transit stops, but not in regards to parking structures, and I don't think that should be ignored, because I frankly find it kind of ridiculous that, for example, the restaurant that came before us, Protégé, which was a building that had sat vacant for I don't even know how long, because it was built for ground floor retail, and we had to change it so that a restaurant could be in there. And then we had a very long discussion about the square footage and the parking requirements, and ended up allowing them to put in a scissor lift, which takes up 3 spaces in order to create 5 spaces. But now no cars park there because no one wants to go anywhere near it. So I welcome you to go and look at their garage. And so, that wasn't, to me, a good solution. And right behind Protégé is a big, huge, empty parking structure in the evening time that you can park in. Daytime, Cal Ave, completely different scenario. So I just think looking holistically at the existing structures makes sense, as well as looking at just reducing or changing the retail requirements in general. And I just want to point out one, again, on that study that you're going to look into further with car ownership in the downtown area at the 93%. I'm a perfect case example of that, in that we didn't have to have 2 cars. We don't really need 2 cars. My car sits there most of the time. We have 2 cars because we can. So even though your studies might support these findings, when you build it, people will park there if they need to. So it's one of those things where we don't really know. In my opinion, you can't study it enough to know whether or not there'll be an impact and why people have cars and why they don't have cars. Just throwing that out there anecdotally. Thank you.
And I'll just give you the same response I gave Commissioner Suma. We're not going to be able to answer that question, right? I mean, people's behaviors are what they are, and a study, we're not tracking them 24/7. We don't know what the different. So, but I did want to also comment on the retail component. So these are great comments that we've received, and we should probably have more of a conversation about Cal Ave, particularly on parking. What we're interested in when we talk about parking, Janani, you're about to miss the best part.
Don't leave now. Don't leave now.
Naughty, stay.
So when we're talking about retail, to the extent that we're addressing those in a mixed-use development, and how retail might be modified in mixed-use developments in particular is what we're looking for, because that's the added cost for housing. Clearly, we can have another conversation about standalone retail or retail on Cal Ave or those other places.
Yeah, so I think, we can sync up with you on, how we kind of formulate this to get it to the next meeting or the meeting after that, based on what you said, and based on what you've heard, just sort of as the normal planning process. Okay, good. Let's move on to the next agenda item, which is approval of the minutes of April 25th, 18. I was not present, so I won't be voting on this, but everybody else here was.
I'll move approval.
Commissioner Suma moved to approve.
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Monk. All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 5, 0. Yeah, you were. 5-0 with 1 abstention. Okay, I don't think there are any committee items. So any other, questions, comments, announcements? And I don't think we can go into future agenda items at this point, right? Because we went as far as we could on that, so. Yeah, Commissioner Gardias?
Question to the Director Light. When can we receive update on the overpasses, on the train overpasses option selection? The reason I'm asking, because the process keeps going on, and it looks to me that that options are being narrowed down every week, couple of weeks. I can see some notes in the local press, so I'd like to have Commssion to receive some visibility on the process.
Yeah, well, I think last night the City Council, Tuesday, the City Council had a discussion about the topic, about the Caltrain and
Grade separation?
Grade separation, thank you, I was blanking on the word. And so that might be an area to first start if you're interested in catching up on that project. I believe I wasn't at the meeting, but I believe the council narrowed it down to 10 different alternatives or scenarios to look at. And I believe that before the council goes on break, there's going to be a policy and services meeting where they're going to take up the the topic again. So if you're not already signed up to those policy and services email alerts, then that might be something to do if you're interested in tracking that. And there may be another conversation before council goes on break. So those are things that I can alert you to if that gets scheduled.
Yes, I mean, this was from the personal visibility, but when will we receive official update on this topic?
Well, I suppose I can report out what the council's done, but I mean, this is, the council's having public hearings and meetings about this. So that's the official discourse of the topic at the moment.
With no schedule of an update to PTC at site?
Well, I mean, are you asking just for an update of what the council's done, or are you asking for commission input into the discussion?
Yes, I mean, some update would, of course, tie to some input of the commission. So the reason that I'm asking is that that while different options are being removed from consideration, I have no visibility. I, of course, would appreciate a link to or some mailer that I can subscribe to. If that is the process, I'd be happy to personally get updates, and probably others too. But I would like to understand what options are being removed. The reason I'm asking, because at the end of the day, we will be faced with few options, which we would have to provide input to, while other options, and then there may be some value in other options, would be removed from our visibility. And then for this reason, some potential input or exchange between the commission and the process may be lost in the translation, because we will never be able to speak to some other options already gone.
Thank you, Commissioner Gardias. And so I'll just say this. At this point, the Planning Commission does not have a direct role in the grade separation discussion. However, as individual residents, you are all able to participate in the council discussions and offer your individual comments, and that would be the forum to do so.
Okay. I just wanted to report that the Baylands Golf Links is open, officially open after 7 years, and yeah, there's the tchotchke. Looks beautiful, and it's all about land use, because we created 10 more acres out there that's just for future use, and I think it's 75 fewer acres of watered turf because it's all grasses and stuff. So it was a nice little ceremony that we had out there. Commissioner Alchek?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the schedule. The May 9th meeting was canceled, right?
May? Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm being told it is. Yes.
Okay, that's not reflected on packet page 5. I just think it should be. And then my only other question was, with respect to June 27th, do we know what, is there anything you can tell us about the discussion on PTC bylaws and procedure?
Well, I can tell you what else is tentatively scheduled for that meeting. You have an appeal of a conditional use permit at 999 Alma that the Planning Commission will consider. The director approved a gym to locate at the former anthropology site, and the commission will be having a public hearing on that appeal. We anticipate coming back and having further housing discussion. We're not having that. That's going to be in July. Okay. And you have a tentative map that is going to be presented to the commission. And then lastly, this discussion on the bylaws and procedures. And so this was something that I think the commission has talked about at the retreat, and there's been a couple of spotty sort of conversations that we've had since then. I understand that staff has some recommended changes to the bylaws just to streamline procedures, and I think maybe the chair may have some thoughts on that. So what we'd like to do is present a strikeout underlined version of your bylaws that the commission would have a discussion about and vote to accept or not.
Okay. And then my second question was, is this the first appeal to a CUP that, I think this may be one of the first appeals of a CUP that this body has heard in a very long time. And so I think it would be, I didn't know that that was coming, but since you mentioned it, I would be, I think it would really be helpful if there was some portion of the packet that helped us understand the parameters of an appeal, since I don't know that I'm assuming this was a director's approval that's getting appealed. I don't know that we've done an appeal in a really long time.
Yeah, it's relatively straightforward. So Albert's suggesting that it's similar to the First Baptist, and I hope it's not going to be. But the process is similar in that the findings that you have to make for the CUP are the same. Anyways, we'll lay that out for you in the staff report and make that clear what the commission's parameters are.
Okay, yeah, I'd just be curious to know like how the appeal process works. Is the appeal by right? You just file one?
Yeah, we'll lay that out for you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Straightforward.
Okay, unless there are any other comments? Oh, sorry, what?
Just had a question. Any idea on Castellet, if that's coming to us? Also, is the downtown parking garages going, downtown parking study, rather, is that coming back to us? Those two things, because we were...
What was your first question?
The Castellet, they came to us with their, I guess for their draft.
That was a CEQA, right?
Yeah, I thought they were going to come back at some point. I'm just curious as to where things are at on it.
Yeah, I'd have to check on the parking study. I think
the downtown paid parking was one question, and then also just if you can give us an update on where the garages are, because
right. I believe there is a discussion scheduled before the council goes on break on the paid parking study. So I'll look for that and send an email to the commission if that's coming up. Regarding the garages, I believe we're working on the environmental analysis for the downtown parking garage, and so that's just going through the planning process. The CalAV one is, and the public safety building is going to council on, I think, June 11th. And your other question about Castellet, we've received some updated plan information, and the project will be presented to the commission, at least some form of it. I know the map's coming forward to the commission, and I don't know if other aspects of it are, so we'll have to take a look at that, but that's not going to happen probably until later in the year.
Okay, just, people might ask us in the community about certain things, so it's just nice to know generally what's happening and not happening. And then also, is it possible to get some sort of report from TMA, or maybe you can include it in the package? I don't really know what this streetlight trip visualization tool is that we're doing in the middle of June.
Yeah, that's not directly related to the TMA, I don't believe, but I can speak with Josh Mello about coming back to the commission with an update on the TMA.
Thank you.
When we have our bylaws and procedures discussion, are we going to discuss the option of having a consent calendar at PTC? Because we did that once and we don't have a procedure recently. Do we want to do that, or are you thinking that's something we want to have as a tool?
Yeah, I think, we will include a discussion of that discussion or that topic when it comes to the commission.
All right. Absent any further comments, we stand adjourned. Thanks very much for your efficiency tonight. Really appreciate that. Everyone does.